Before we begin, if you're enjoying this journey into one of America's most disturbing conspiracy theories, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow in ways you might not realise, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for sleep in Australia, commuting to work in London, or relaxing at home somewhere in between. Now, let's descend into a story that challenges everything we think we know about time, memory and government secrets. There's a place on Long Island where the grass grows differently, where compasses spin without reason, where locals refuse to walk after dark. It's not marked on most maps anymore. The government says it's just an old park. But the man sitting across from me in a Brooklyn coffee shop knows better. His hands shake as he slides a notebook across the table. The pages smell like mildew and something else. Something chemical. Something wrong. Time doesn't work the same there, he whispers. It never did, and they never really shut it down. His name is Nicholas Barrett, though he admits that might not be his real name anymore. He can't be certain. When you've had your memories erased and rewritten multiple times, identity becomes fluid. What he does know is that he was part of something called the MONTAUK project, a covert military program that officially never existed, a program that experimented with human consciousness, perception, and according to Nicholas, the fabric of time itself. The notebook contains coordinates, radiation readings, lists of names spanning more than a decade, boys who disappeared, scientists who died under mysterious circumstances, military personnel who checked themselves into psychiatric facilities and never spoke again. The last page reads, "The chair remembers, the station was never shut down. Time doesn't forget us. My name is Aaron Blake, I'm a freelance journalist, and this is the story of how I discovered that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed." Act 1. The Real History Camp. Hero sits on the easternmost tip of Long Island, jutting into the Atlantic like an accusatory finger. During World War II, it served as a coastal defence station, one of many built to protect against potential Nazi invasion. Massive concrete bunkers still dot the landscape, half buried in sand and scrub grass. Artillery positions that once bristled with guns now serve as perches for seagulls. But Camp Hero's real transformation came in the late 1950s when the military installed something that would define its silhouette for decades, a massive SAGE radar tower. Standing nearly 80 feet tall, this AN/FPS-7 radar was part of the semi-automatic ground environment system, designed to detect Soviet bombers during the height of the Cold War. The tower was a marvel of its time, capable of tracking aircraft hundreds of miles out over the Atlantic. According to official records, Camp Hero was decommissioned in 1981, budget cuts, end of an era. The property eventually became part of Camp Hero State Park, open to hikers and history enthusiasts. The radar tower still stands, now a rusting monument to Cold War paranoia. But here's where the official story starts to crack. Throughout the 1990s, dozens of former employees came forward with a different narrative. In interviews, depositions, and self-published accounts, they insisted that Camp Hero never truly closed. That beneath the surface operations, something else continued. Something classified. Something that had nothing to do with detecting Soviet aircraft. I started my investigation the way any good journalist does, with public records. Camp Hero's history is surprisingly well documented up to a point. Construction permits, personnel rosters, equipment manifests, everything you'd expect from a military installation. Then, around 1971, the documentation becomes spotty, redacted. In some cases, entire years are missing from the archives. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Most came back with heavily censored documents or outright denials. No records exist. Information classified for national security purposes. Request denied per exemption. The first 3 months of research yielded almost nothing. I spent hours in the National Archives, scrolling through microfilm until my eyes burned. I contacted former military personnel through veterans organisations. Most refused to talk. Those who did speak offered only vague recollections, carefully worded to avoid anything that might be classified. I interviewed a former radar technician who'd worked at Camp Hero from 1977 to 1980. His name was Michael Torres, retired to Florida, living in a modest house near Tampa. He agreed to meet me at a local diner, but the moment I mentioned the MONTAUK project specifically, his demeanour changed. "I don't know anything about that," he said, suddenly interested in his coffee. "But you were stationed there during the exact years the project supposedly operated." "I worked on radar systems, standard operations, nothing unusual." "Did you ever go underground? Into the tunnel system beneath the base?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We weren't allowed in certain sections. That wasn't unusual for a military facility. Compartmentalization, need-to-know basis. I assumed it was just classified communications equipment or something." "But you wondered?" Another pause. "There were rumours. Techs who went down to the lower levels for maintenance would come back acting strange, disoriented. One guy claimed he lost 6 hours down there, though his watch showed only 30 minutes had passed. Nobody took him seriously, but there were enough odd stories that most of us preferred to stay topside." Torres wouldn't say more. After we parted ways, I tried to follow up with him by phone. His number was disconnected. I reached out to his daughter through social media. She told me her father had suffered a stroke 2 days after our meeting and was no longer able to communicate effectively. The timing felt wrong, but I had no evidence of anything beyond tragic coincidence. But one document did come through, and it changed everything. It was an employment record from Brookhaven National Laboratory, dated 1973. Brookhaven is a real facility on Long Island, established in 1947 for nuclear research. It's conducted legitimate scientific work for decades, but it's also been connected to classified government projects, weapons research, and according to some researchers, experiments that push the boundaries of physics and human consciousness. The employment record listed a contractor, Preston B. Nichols. Preston Nichols is a real person. In 1992, he published a book called The MONTAUK Project: Experiments in Time. In it, he claimed to be a recovered memory victim of a covert program run at Camp Hero throughout the 1970s and early 80s. According to Nichols, the project focused on mind control, psychic enhancement, and temporal manipulation. He described a device called the MONTAUK chair, designed to amplify human consciousness and, allegedly, create tangible manifestations of thought. Most dismiss Nichols as a conspiracy theorist, a fantasist spinning tales for profit. But here was documented proof that a Preston B. Nichols had indeed been contracted at Brookhaven during the exact time frame he described. It didn't prove his claims, but it established that he wasn't simply inventing his entire history. I needed to know more about what Brookhaven was actually doing during those years. I spent 2 weeks at the Brookhaven archives, going through every document available from the 1970s. Most were technical papers on nuclear physics, particle acceleration, material science. Legitimate research. Nothing suspicious. But I noticed patterns in what was missing. Certain project numbers had no corresponding documentation. Budget line items listed as special projects research, with no further detail. Personnel rosters that showed scientists assigned to departments that, according to other records, didn't exist. Through a contact at a university library, I obtained archived scientific papers from Brookhaven researchers in the 1970s. Most were dry, technical documents about particle physics and material science. But one paper, published in 1974 and quickly retracted, discussed experimental work on electromagnetic field effects on human cognition and perception. The lead researcher's name had been redacted, but the methodology was startling. The experiments involved placing subjects in isolation chambers while exposing them to specific electromagnetic frequencies. The goal was to determine if EM fields could influence memory formation, enhance pattern recognition, or alter temporal perception. Temporal perception. The ability to accurately judge the passage of time. The paper was only 12 pages long, but it described a series of experiments that today would never pass any ethics review. Subjects were exposed to electromagnetic fields at various frequencies for extended periods. Some reported feeling time slow down or speed up. Others experienced vivid hallucinations. A few claimed to see events that hadn't happened yet, though the paper dismissed these as confabulation consistent with sensory deprivation effects. Most disturbing was a section describing enhanced subjects who showed unusual sensitivity to the EM fields. These individuals reportedly experienced dramatic alterations in consciousness, including what the paper termed reality displacement phenomena. The description was vague, deliberately so, but it suggested these subjects were perceiving or experiencing something beyond standard hallucination. The paper concluded that certain frequencies did produce measurable effects, though the results were inconsistent and require further investigation. It also noted that coordination with Department of Defense facilities may provide enhanced testing environments. I found a footnote referencing Eastern Defense Station. Eastern Defense Station was the original designation for Camp Hero. I tried to find the retracted paper's author. The university archives claimed not to have that information. I contacted Brookhaven directly. They told me the research had been discontinued and all related materials were archived under classified protocols. When I pushed, citing Freedom of Information Act provisions, they referred me to the Department of Energy, which referred me to the Department of Defense, which told me the information was exempt from FOIA due to national security concerns. A paper on electromagnetic effects on human perception, published briefly in 1974, was still classified 50 years later. That alone told me I was onto something real. I reached out to other researchers who'd been at Brookhaven during that era. Most didn't respond. 2 agreed to speak with me off the record. Both confirmed that there had been classified programs running alongside the public research. Programs they weren't briefed on but knew existed because of the personnel movements, the restricted areas, the funding that didn't appear in public budgets. One researcher, an elderly physicist named Thomas Chen, told me something that stuck with me. In the 70s, we were terrified of falling behind the Soviets, not just in weapons, but in everything. There were persistent rumours that Soviet researchers had made breakthroughs in psychic phenomena, that they had remote viewers who could spy on our facilities, that they were developing mind control techniques. We couldn't let them have an advantage, so we pursued everything, no matter how fringe it seemed. Some programs were legitimate science pushed to extremes. Others were pure desperation dressed up as research. Was Camp Hero one of those programs? I asked. Chen looked at me with tired eyes. I never worked at Camp Hero. I don't know what they did there, but I knew people who did, and I know that some of them came back changed. Not physically, but changed. Like they'd seen something that broke something inside them. He wouldn't elaborate further. As I was leaving, he said one more thing. Be careful which doors you open. Some of us spent our careers trying to close doors that other people opened. Not all of them stayed closed. Act 2. The first clues beneath Camp Hero. Camp Hero State Park is open to the public, but large sections remain fenced off. Structural hazard signs warn visitors away from certain areas. The old radar tower is off limits, surrounded by chain link and barbed wire. Official explanation: the structure is unstable, a liability. But here's an interesting fact that anyone can verify. That supposedly abandoned radar tower still draws electrical power. I obtained utility records through a public records request. According to Con Edison, the electrical infrastructure serving Camp Hero has never been fully disconnected. In fact, monitoring equipment records small but consistent power draws from the facility. Nothing massive, but enough to run lighting, ventilation and electronic equipment. When I asked a Con Edison representative about this, they told me the power was for maintenance and safety systems. When I pressed for specifics, they referred me to a federal agency. That agency referred me to another agency. That agency told me the information was classified. Why would an abandoned state park require classified electrical systems? Through FOIA requests that took nearly 8 months to process, I eventually received heavily redacted documents from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. These documents confirmed what the utility records suggested. Monitoring equipment has been recording unexplained electrical activity at Camp Hero as recently as 1998, years after the supposed decommissioning. The activity wasn't random. According to the logs, energy spikes occurred every few weeks, lasting between 3 and 7 minutes. The pattern was too regular to be equipment malfunction or environmental interference. Something down there was turning on, running a cycle, and shutting down again. I created a timeline of the power spikes. They occurred almost exactly every 19 days. Sometimes the interval was 18 days, sometimes 20, but the pattern was clear. Whatever was running below ground operated on a schedule. I cross-referenced the power spike dates with other data I'd collected. Weather reports, geological surveys, local police reports, and I found something interesting. On several of the dates corresponding to power spikes, local residents had reported unusual phenomena. Compass anomalies, electronic equipment malfunctions. In one case, a massive flight of birds veering suddenly away from the area, as if fleeing something. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started looking into the missing children. Nicholas's notebook contained a list of names, most with dates from the mid-1970s. At first, I assumed they were participants in the alleged project, perhaps military personnel or civilian contractors. Then I noticed the ages listed next to some names: 12, 14, 13, 11. 2 names had been circled in red ink: John Reyes and Mark Atwood. John Reyes disappeared from his home in East Hampton on a July evening in 1975. He was 13 years old. He told his parents he was going to ride his bike to a friend's house just a few blocks away. He never arrived. Despite extensive searches and a police investigation that lasted months, no trace of John was ever found. The case remains unsolved. I tracked down John's mother, Maria Reyes, still living in the same house where she'd raised her son. She was in her 70s now, health failing, but she agreed to speak with me. We sat in her living room, photographs of John covering every surface, a shrine to a boy who'd never come home. He was special, she told me, her voice still carrying the weight of decades-old grief. Not just to me, because every mother thinks their child is special. But John was different. He had dreams that came true. He knew things he shouldn't know. When he was 8, he told me my sister was going to call with bad news. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. My sister's husband had been in a car accident. Did anyone ever show interest in John's abilities? I asked carefully. Maria nodded slowly. A few months before he disappeared, a man came to the house, said he was from a special school for gifted children. He asked if John had any unusual talents, asked if we'd consider enrolling him in a summer program. I said no. I didn't trust him. Something about the way he looked at John, like he was evaluating merchandise. Did you tell the police about this man when John disappeared? I tried. They said there was no record of any special school programs in the area. They thought I was misremembering, grief making me confused. But I wasn't confused. That man was real, and I've always wondered if John didn't go to his friend's house that night, if maybe he went looking for that man instead. She showed me John's room, preserved exactly as it had been in 1975. Posters on the walls, books on shelves, a diary in a desk drawer. Maria let me read it. The entries from the last month before John's disappearance were disturbing. He wrote about dreams of a white room, a chair with wires, men in lab coats asking him questions. In one entry, dated a week before he vanished, he wrote, "The dreams feel more real than being awake, like I'm remembering something that already happened, or maybe something that's happening right now, somewhere else. I want to find the white room. I want to understand." Mark Atwood vanished 2 years later in 1977, 14 years old, last seen leaving a summer camp in Montauk. Unlike John's case, Mark's disappearance was stranger. Witnesses reported seeing him walking toward the old Camp Hero facility. When camp counsellors went looking for him, they found his bicycle leaning against the perimeter fence. Mark was gone. I found Mark's sister, Jennifer, living in Boston. She was reluctant to talk at first, but when I mentioned that I was investigating Camp Hero and the possibility of a connection to her brother's disappearance, she agreed to meet. Mark changed in the weeks before he disappeared, Jennifer told me. He'd always been a normal kid, played sports, had friends, did okay in school, but that summer he became obsessed with dreams. He'd wake up screaming. My parents took him to a therapist, but Mark wouldn't talk about what he was seeing. Did he ever describe the dreams? I asked. Jennifer pulled out a box she'd kept for decades. Mark's belongings, things their parents had saved. Inside was a notebook, similar to the one Nicholas had given me. Mark's handwriting filled the pages, describing dreams in vivid detail. The dreams were consistent. A large room filled with equipment, a chair that hummed with energy, other children sitting in darkness waiting their turn, and something else, a presence. Mark called it the thing that watches from the corners. He drew pictures of it, crude sketches that showed a shape that didn't quite make sense geometrically, too many angles, surfaces that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The camp counsellors said Mark had been acting strange the last few days, Jennifer continued, walking in his sleep, standing at the edge of the property staring toward Camp Hero. One counsellor said she caught him trying to sneak out in the middle of the night. When she asked where he was going, Mark said he had to go back, that they were calling him, that he was supposed to be there. Did the police investigate Camp Hero? They asked if anyone there had seen Mark. Official answer was no, but the investigation was shut down quickly. My parents tried to push, tried to get them to search the base, but they were told it was federal property and outside local jurisdiction. Federal investigators supposedly looked into it, but we never heard anything. Eventually, we were told Mark was most likely a runaway, and he'd probably come home when he was ready. He never did. Police reports from both cases are public record. I read through them multiple times, looking for connections. Both boys disappeared during summer months. Both were last seen in areas within a few miles of Camp Hero. Both cases featured witness statements describing the boys as seeming distracted, or not acting like themselves, in the days before they vanished. Most disturbingly, in Mark Atwood's case, a camp counsellor reported that Mark had been talking about weird dreams the week before his disappearance. Dreams about a white room, a metal chair, and voices asking him questions. I found 3 more cases. Boys who'd disappeared in the Montauk area between 1971 and 1983, all between the ages of 10 and 15. All described by families as having unusual abilities or sensitivities. All vanished without a trace. Next to the circled names in Nicholas's notebook was a handwritten note. Test subject, psychic resonance age range. I needed to talk to someone who had actually worked at Camp Hero during those years. Someone credible. Someone who couldn't be easily dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Through connections in the military research community, I managed to arrange an interview with a retired officer who served at the base in the early 1970s. Lieutenant Colonel John Alexander, a real figure known for his work researching paranormal topics for military applications. Alexander had a distinguished career and published work on non-lethal weapons, consciousness studies, and what he termed warrior science. We met at a restaurant in Virginia. Alexander was in his 70s but still sharp, still careful with his words. He knew why I wanted to talk to him, and he'd agreed to the meeting with one condition: no recording devices. I asked him directly about the MONTAUK project. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Camp Hero ran tests outside normal channels during the period you're asking about. Some were behavioural, some involved perception studies, some..." He paused. "Some weren't easily categorised. Were children involved?" I asked. Another long pause. There were programs throughout the Cold War that pushed ethical boundaries. We were terrified of Soviet capabilities, real or imagined. That fear led to decisions that, in retrospect, were questionable. That's not an answer. It's the answer you'll get from anyone who was actually there, he said. The people who know won't talk. The people who talk don't know, and the files that might tell the truth are buried so deep they might as well not exist. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping. But I'll tell you this. There were programs designed to identify and recruit individuals with unusual cognitive abilities, children in particular, because their neural plasticity made them ideal subjects for enhancement protocols. Official programs like the remote viewing research were the tip of the iceberg. Below that, there were darker programs that didn't care about consent or safety, programs that were willing to sacrifice a few children if it meant gaining an advantage over the Soviets. Was Camp Hero one of those programs? Alexander was silent for a long time. Finally, I visited Camp Hero twice during the relevant period. Official visits, coordinating research between facilities. The surface operations were exactly what they appeared to be. Radar monitoring, communications, standard Cold War defence installations, but there were sections I wasn't cleared to access, underground facilities that officially didn't exist. I saw children being escorted into those facilities. I asked about them. I was told they were part of a gifted education program partnered with local schools. But you didn't believe that. I knew what our programs looked like. I knew the language, the protocols. What I saw at Camp Hero wasn't education, it was experimentation. And the children... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the memory. They had this look, empty, like something had been taken from them. But then he said something that sent a chill through me. If you're serious about investigating this, you should know that certain questions have consequences. There are people who have devoted careers to making sure specific doors stay closed. If you start picking those locks, don't be surprised when someone comes to see what you're doing. Is that a threat? It's a warning. From someone who's seen what happens to people who push too hard into classified operations. Some lose their careers, some lose their credibility, some just disappear. Not dramatically, not in ways that raise suspicion. They have accidents, health problems, or they simply stop pursuing their investigations and no one quite knows why. Did that happen to people looking into Montauk? Alexander stood to leave. It's happened to people looking into everything the government wants to keep hidden. Montauk is just one door among many, but it might be one of the most important. Because if what you're investigating is real, if the project actually achieved what people claim, then time itself might be compromised, and that's not something any government can afford to admit. Act 3. The project itself. To understand the Montauk project, you have to understand the scientific and political context of the Cold War. By the 1970s, both the United States and Soviet Union had moved beyond conventional weapons research into stranger territories. Psychic espionage, remote viewing, mind control, consciousness manipulation. These weren't fringe ideas pursued by cranks in basements. They were serious programs with serious funding. The CIA's MK-Ultra program is well documented. From 1953 to 1973, the agency conducted experiments on unwitting subjects, testing LSD, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and other techniques meant to produce mind control capabilities. The program was real. The documents are declassified. The horror is undeniable. What's less known is that MK-Ultra had sister programs, sub-projects that branched into different areas of research. One was the Stargate project, which investigated psychic phenomena and remote viewing. The US government spent 20 years and millions of dollars trying to determine if humans could develop reliable extrasensory perception. The results were mixed. Some remote viewers showed abilities that defied conventional explanation. Most didn't. But the research continued, classified and compartmentalized, with different agencies pursuing different angles. According to Nicholas, the MONTAUK project was one of those angles, and it went further than anyone publicly admits. Over the course of several meetings, Nicholas gradually revealed more details. Each session was difficult for him. He would start strong, memories flowing, but within an hour he'd begin to deteriorate. Words would come slower, his hands would shake more violently. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence and stare into space, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. We weren't reading minds, Nicholas told me during one of our earlier meetings. His hands shook as he spoke, the way they always did when discussing the project. We were creating realities, or at least that's what they wanted us to do. The centrepiece of the project was allegedly a device called the MONTAUK chair. Nicholas described it in detail. A modified dental chair with cranial attachments, electromagnetic coils, and sensory deprivation elements. Subjects would sit in the chair while technicians adjusted frequencies, monitoring brain activity and physiological responses. The chair was built around technology from the Philadelphia experiment, Nicholas claimed. Or at least that's what they told us. Electromagnetic equipment that had been confiscated from that operation and kept in storage for decades. They retrofitted it, modernized it, connected it to the most powerful radar system on the East Coast. The Philadelphia experiment is itself a conspiracy theory. The claim that in 1943 the Navy made a destroyer escort briefly invisible during a secret test. Most historians dismiss it as fantasy. But Nicholas insisted the technology was real and had been repurposed for MONTAUK. The radar tower wasn't just detecting aircraft, he said. It was generating massive electromagnetic fields that could be focused and directed. The chair was the targeting mechanism, a human brain, enhanced and amplified, used to shape and direct those fields. The official goal, Nicholas claimed, was to enhance psychic abilities, to find individuals who could project thoughts, influence others at a distance, or perceive events beyond normal sensory range. They tested hundreds of kids. Most couldn't do anything significant. The fields would disorient them, maybe cause hallucinations, but nothing useful. Some got sick, a few had seizures. But those of us who could do it, who could actually interface with the chair... He trailed off, lost in memory. What happened when you interfaced with it? I pressed. The first few times, it was overwhelming. Like every thought I'd ever had was being pulled out of my head and projected into the room. I could see my thoughts taking shape in the air, transparent at first, like smoke, then more solid. The technicians were excited. They pushed harder, cranked up the power. And then I started creating things that weren't from my thoughts, or at least not from my conscious thoughts. Things from dreams, from nightmares, from somewhere else. The chair was a doorway, and it opened in both directions. I could push things through, but things could also come back. Nicholas described experiments that grew progressively more ambitious and dangerous. Initially, they had him create simple objects, geometric shapes, colours, basic forms. He could manifest them for seconds before they dissolved. But as his abilities developed, as they learned to tune the equipment more precisely, he could create more complex things. Animals, he said. They had me create animals. I'd think of a cat and a cat would appear. Not solid, not entirely real, but solid enough to touch. It would move around the room, behave like a cat, then fade after a few minutes. They were ecstatic. Where were these manifestations coming from? That's what they wanted to know. They theorized I was pulling energy from the quantum field, giving it shape through consciousness, or maybe accessing parallel dimensions, or creating temporary rifts in space-time. They didn't know. All they knew was that it worked. But as the experiments continued, things started going wrong. There were other kids in the program, 6 that I knew of, though I think there were more. We'd see each other in the hallways, in the waiting areas. We weren't supposed to talk to each other, but we did when the guards weren't watching. One boy, Tommy, he could see the future. Not clearly, not reliably, but he'd get flashes. Another girl, she could move things with her mind. Small things, but real telekinesis. What happened to them? Nicholas's face went pale. Tommy started seeing the same future over and over. The White Room filled with something dark, something massive. He said it was coming, that we were opening a door we couldn't close. He got more and more agitated, started refusing to participate in experiments. They sedated him, forced him into the chair anyway. He had a seizure during the test. Died right there in the chair. They killed him. They killed several of us. Not intentionally, or at least that's what they claimed. Just casualties of important research. The program was more important than the individual lives. That's what the lead scientist told us. We were serving our country. Nicholas described a lead scientist he knew only as Brennan, a physicist who'd transferred from Brookhaven. Brennan was the one who designed the chair, who understood the theoretical framework behind what they were attempting. Brennan believed consciousness was fundamental to reality, Nicholas said. That observation doesn't just measure reality, it creates it. The chair was designed to amplify that effect, to let a single consciousness shape reality on a larger scale. He thought if we could perfect the technique, we could manifest anything. Weapons, resources, eventually even manipulate time itself. Time manipulation? That was the end game. They believed that if consciousness could shape space, it could also shape time. They started running experiments where they'd have me try to project thoughts into the past or future. I don't know if it worked, but I started having memories of things that hadn't happened yet, or memories of things that happened differently than I remembered originally. It was like reality was becoming fluid. How did you escape? Nicholas went very quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. I didn't escape. That's the thing you need to understand. I'm still there. Part of me never left that chair. I'm experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. In one timeline, I'm sitting here talking to you. In another, I'm still 13 years old, strapped into that chair, creating horrors. The timelines overlap, that's what they did. They broke time, and some of us got caught in the break. I didn't know how to respond to that. It sounded like severe disassociation, trauma manifesting as delusional belief. But the way he said it, the absolute conviction in his voice, made me wonder. Asta 4. The breakthrough. Nicholas had given me coordinates, specific GPS numbers that supposedly marked an entrance to the underground complex, one that wasn't commonly known or monitored. I won't publish those coordinates here, both for legal reasons and because what I found suggests they lead somewhere that should stay closed. I drove out to MONTAUK on a grey October morning. The park was nearly empty, just a few dedicated hikers and photographers capturing the autumn light. I parked near the old artillery positions and began walking, GPS unit in hand, trying to look like a tourist wandering the trails. The coordinates led me away from the main paths, into an area thick with scrub oak and briars. I pushed through, jacket snagging on branches, compass spinning wildly in my hand. The needle wouldn't settle, rotating through all points as if magnetic north had ceased to exist. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS. The app showed my position, but the map tiles wouldn't load. Signal was strong, but something was interfering. The screen flickered, showing my location jumping between different points, sometimes showing me miles away, then snapping back to my actual position. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. My skin prickled with static. The hair on my arms stood up. I heard a low-frequency hum, felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground. Then I reached a clearing. There was a concrete pad, roughly 10 feet, square, covered with graffiti and weathering. It looked like an old foundation or loading area, but at one corner, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, was something that didn't fit. A steel door set flush into the concrete. The door was painted the same weathered grey as the surrounding concrete, meant to blend in. It was secured with a heavy padlock, but what caught my attention was the lock itself. It wasn't a standard commercial lock. It had a serial number stamped into the housing that matched federal issue specifications. I'd done enough research on military equipment to recognise the model. These locks were used on secure facilities, designed to be resistant to picking, cutting and tampering. They had to be opened with specific keys that contained electronic chips. You couldn't just cut them off with bolt cutters. Why would an abandoned state park have federal-grade locks on underground doors? I'd brought a Geiger counter with me, the kind you can order online for a few $100s. Not military-grade, but sensitive enough to detect elevated radiation. When I held it near the door, the reading spiked immediately. Not dangerously high, but well above background levels. Consistent with old equipment that used radioactive components, or with materials that had been exposed to radiation. I pressed my ear to the door. At first I heard nothing. The forest around me was quiet, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just silence and that low-frequency hum. Then, faint but distinct, a sound came from below. Mechanical, rhythmic, like generators running deep underground. A steady throb that seemed to sync with my heartbeat for a moment before diverging again. I tried the lock with tools I'd brought, but it was beyond my skill to open. I would need to come back with better equipment or find another way in. But just finding the door exactly where Nicholas said it would be, with evidence of active systems below ground, was enough to confirm that his information had substance. As I was preparing to leave, I heard something else, a sound that didn't fit the environment. A low-frequency pulse, barely audible, felt more than heard. It came from beneath my feet, a rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with my heartbeat for a moment before fading away. I checked the Geiger counter again. The readings were fluctuating now, rising and falling in time with the pulses. The pattern was regular, a spike every few seconds, perfectly timed, as if something below was cycling through operations. I took photographs, careful to document everything. The door, the lock, the concrete pad, the surrounding area. I made notes on my phone, recorded video, captured GPS coordinates. Evidence. Proof that this place existed. Something was running down there. Something was active. I stood there for nearly an hour listening to the pulses, feeling them through the ground. At one point my nose started bleeding. Just a trickle. Nothing serious. But it startled me. I wiped it away and noticed my hands were shaking. The sun was setting. I needed to leave before dark, before park rangers came around to close the gates. But I felt compelled to stay, as if something was pulling me toward that door, calling me to find a way inside. I forced myself to walk away. But that night, lying in a motel room in Montauk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a threshold. That by finding that door, by confirming Nicholas's information, I'd moved from investigating a story to being part of it. Over the next few weeks I went back 3 more times. Each visit I learned more. I discovered that the door wasn't the only entrance. Using Nicholas's diagrams I found 2 more access points, both similarly secured, both showing signs of regular maintenance despite the facility being supposedly abandoned. On my 3rd visit I nearly got caught. I was examining one of the doors when I heard vehicles approaching. Military vehicles. I hid in the brush and watched as a group of men in unmarked uniforms emerged. They unlocked one of the doors and descended into the facility carrying equipment cases. They were down there for nearly 2 hours. When they emerged, they locked the door, did a sweep of the area with handheld devices that looked like radiation detectors or EM field monitors, then drove away. The facility wasn't abandoned. It was still in use. Whatever the MONTAUK project had been, whatever it had become, it was still operational. I documented everything. Photographed the vehicles before they left, noted the times, tried to get license plate numbers, but the plates were government issue with numbers that didn't show up in any public database I could access. I also started experiencing strange effects. My equipment would malfunction near the site. Cameras would show strange artifacts in photos, geometric patterns that weren't visible to the naked eye. Audio recorders would pick up voices speaking in frequencies outside normal human range, which when played back slowly sounded almost like words, though in no language I recognised. And I started having dreams of being underground, walking through white-tiled corridors, hearing children crying behind locked doors, standing in a large chamber with a chair in the centre surrounded by equipment that hummed with power. In the dreams I would sit in the chair, feel the helmet lowered onto my head, feel the electromagnetic fields activate, and then I would see things, shapes forming in the air, creatures from nightmares, and one presence, always watching from the corners, that was vast and dark and somehow hungry. I would wake up with nosebleeds, headaches, a sense of disorientation that would last for hours. I tried to tell myself it was stress, the psychological weight of the investigation, but deep down I knew it was something else. Something about that place was affecting me, reaching out across the distance, pulling me in. Over the next few weeks, I dug deeper into the historical record, looking for any documented anomalies around Camp Hero during the years the project supposedly operated. What I found was fragmentary but suggestive. In August of 1983, there was a significant electromagnetic pulse recorded by monitoring stations along the eastern seaboard. The event lasted approximately 4 minutes and was centred on Long Island. At the time, officials attributed it to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction. But the same day, local hospitals in the Montauk area treated more than a dozen people for symptoms consistent with electromagnetic radiation exposure, disorientation, nausea, temporary vision problems. Most were dismissed as coincidental, perhaps related to a virus or food contamination. Also on that same day, local power grids experienced widespread failures. Radar installations reported equipment glitches, and more than 20 residents called authorities to report strange lights in the sky and unusual animal behaviour. Dogs howling in unison, birds flying in confused patterns, fish washing up dead along the beaches. I found Coast Guard reports of unusual sonar readings off Montauk Point that night. Something large moving underwater, too big and too fast to be a whale or submarine. The readings showed an object roughly the size of a building, moving at speeds that defied conventional explanation, then simply vanishing from sonar as if it had ceased to exist. The date was August 12, 1983. According to Montauk Project lore, this was the day the project ended, the day something went catastrophically wrong during an experiment. Preston Nichols called it the Montauk Break, claiming that a subject in the chair created a manifestation that couldn't be controlled, forcing an emergency shutdown. I found a report from Brookhaven National Laboratory's medical facility for that same night. 3 unidentified patients were admitted with extreme psychological trauma. The intake notes described them as non-responsive, exhibiting signs of acute dissociative episodes. No identification was found on any of them. No family came forward. One nurse's note, almost buried in the file, described the patients as speaking in unison, before lapsing into catatonia. They repeated the same phrase over and over. It came through. We couldn't stop it. It's still there. Within 6 hours, all 3 were transferred to federal custody. The report provided no explanation for the transfer, no destination, no follow-up. Just a notation. Remanded to federal authority per security protocols. I tried to track those patients. Dead end. The transfer records were classified. The receiving facility wasn't named. It was as if 3 people had simply vanished into the federal system. But I found one more piece of information that connected everything. A meteorologist at a private weather monitoring station recorded unusual atmospheric disturbances over Montauk on August 12, 1983. The data showed what he described as impossible readings: localized gravity variations, temporal distortions in radar readings, and something he couldn't explain. Multiple echo returns showing the same aircraft at different altitudes simultaneously, as if the same object existed in multiple places at once. He reported his findings to the National Weather Service. They told him his equipment was malfunctioning. He insisted it wasn't. They told him to stop making claims that couldn't be substantiated. When he persisted, he was quietly let go from his position. I found him living in upstate New York, retired, still bitter about how he'd been treated. He showed me his original data logs, preserved for 4 decades, waiting for someone to finally take them seriously. Something happened that night, he told me. Something that broke the rules of physics as we understand them. And instead of investigating it, instead of trying to understand it, they buried it. Made everyone involved look crazy or incompetent. But I know what I saw. I know what the data showed, and I know they didn't want anyone looking too closely at what was happening at Camp Hero. Act 5. The cover-up. Every good conspiracy theory has a moment where the cover-up becomes more interesting than the crime. With Montauk, that moment came when I started finding the gaps, the places where records should exist but don't. I filed more than 30 FOA requests over 6 months. Requests for personnel records, equipment manifests, incident reports, anything related to Camp Hero between 1971 and 1983. Most were denied. A few came back with documents so heavily redacted they were useless. But the denials themselves were revealing. Several explicitly cited national security exemptions for information more than 40 years old. What could possibly threaten national security about Cold War radar operations at a decommissioned base? One response I received was particularly interesting. I'd requested documents related to power consumption at Camp Hero during the 1970s. The Department of Energy responded that the records existed, but were classified under special access programs and couldn't be released without approval from multiple agencies, some of which weren't even named in the response. Power consumption records, classified 40 years later. That alone suggested something extraordinary had been happening. I also started noticing patterns in what was missing. Every request that specifically mentioned electromagnetic research was denied. Every request that named Brookhaven National Laboratory in connection with Camp Hero was denied. Every request about the August 1983 incident was denied. The government's own responses were painting a picture. Something happened at Camp Hero, something involving electromagnetic research, and it remains classified decades later. I started getting pushback in other ways too, phone calls at odd hours, nobody on the line. My apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. My laptop was cloned. I could tell because suddenly some of my files had access timestamps from when I was provably elsewhere. A black SUV started appearing near my apartment, always parked in different spots but always within view. When I tried to photograph it, it would drive away. When I tried to follow it, I'd lose it in traffic. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress was making me see conspiracies where none existed. But then I got a visit. 2 men in suits came to my apartment. They showed federal credentials, Homeland Security, and asked if they could come in. I let them, though I shouldn't have without a warrant. They were polite, professional. They asked about my research into Camp Hero. They said they'd noticed my FOIA requests and wanted to understand why I was interested in a long decommissioned military facility. I told them I was researching a story. They asked what kind of story. I said historical, about Cold War operations. They asked if I'd been trespassing on federal property. I said no, though we both knew it was a lie. They spent an hour in my apartment, looking at my notes, my documents, my photographs. They didn't take anything. They didn't threaten me overtly. But when they left, one of them turned back and said, "Sometimes investigations lead places that aren't healthy. Sometimes the truth is less important than stability. You seem like a smart person. I hope you make smart choices." After they left, I checked my apartment. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but I had the sense that everything had been searched, carefully, professionally, by people who knew how to leave no trace. I moved my evidence to multiple locations, uploaded encrypted backups to several cloud services, sent physical copies to friends with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I found the testimony. Through a contact who works in military archives, I obtained a psychological evaluation report from 1983. The subject was a serviceman who'd been stationed at Camp Hero. He'd been referred for evaluation after exhibiting signs of severe distress and paranoia. The evaluation transcript makes for disturbing reading. The serviceman claimed he'd witnessed experiments involving children. He described a white room beneath the base, a metal chair with strange attachments, and tests that broke the kids. He said he'd heard children screaming in the walls, that one boy had made something appear that looked like it was from a nightmare. He described a massive creature, vaguely humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways, that materialized during one test session. According to his testimony, it attacked staff before dissolving into what he called black static. The incident, he claimed, triggered an emergency evacuation of the underground facility. The thing was massive. The transcript read, "Filled the whole chamber, made sounds that weren't sounds, like pressure in your ears. Some of the staff tried to shut down the equipment, but it wouldn't respond. The boy in the chair was screaming, saying he couldn't stop it. It was coming through, and he couldn't close the door. Then there was this sound, like reality tearing, and the thing just was gone. Not faded, just gone, like someone cut it out of existence. But the boy, he wasn't the same after. Eyes were different, empty, like whatever came through took something with it when it left. The evaluating psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute psychotic disorder and recommended immediate hospitalization. His testimony was dismissed as delusional. He was medically discharged and, as far as I can tell, never spoke publicly about his experiences. But here's what made me take his testimony seriously. The details matched Nicholas's account almost exactly. The white room, the chair, a boy who could manifest things, a creature that appeared during a test, an emergency evacuation, two separate sources, no apparent connection to each other, describing the same events. I went back to Nicholas with the evaluation transcript. When he read it, he started crying. "That was me," he whispered. "I was the boy in the chair. I made that thing. I didn't mean to, but they pushed and pushed, and something came through. Something from..." He stopped, unable to continue. "From where?" I asked. "I don't know. Somewhere that isn't now. Somewhere time works differently. The chair opened a door and I couldn't close it. Part of that thing is still here, still connected to me. Sometimes I can feel it watching through my eyes." He looked at me then, and for a moment his eyes did look different, darker, as if something else was looking out from behind them. "It's waiting," he said, "waiting for the door to open again, and they're going to open it. They never stopped the research. They just moved it deeper, made it more secret. The technology is better now. The understanding is clearer. They think they can control it, but they're wrong. Once you open certain doors, you can't control what comes through." Act 6. The final revelation. Nicholas agreed to show me everything. Not just talk, but take me to places. Show me evidence he'd kept hidden for years. He said he'd been afraid to share everything, afraid of what might happen if the full story came out. But he was dying. Lung cancer, stage 4. He had months at best. "I need someone to know," he told me, "before it's too late, before they erase everything." He took me to a storage unit in Queens. The neighbourhood was rough, the facility run down. We went at night, Nicholas insisting we needed darkness for what he was about to show me. Inside the unit were boxes of documents, photographs, and physical items he claimed to have taken from the MONTAUK facility before the final shutdown. They evacuated so fast after the incident, he explained. Emergency protocols, everyone out immediately. Some of us grabbed what we could on the way. I took these, I've kept them hidden ever since. The photographs were the most compelling. Polaroids, dated in the handwriting typical of the 1970s and early 80s. They showed underground rooms, equipment, and in several cases children. Boys ranging from about 10 to 15 years old, sitting in chairs wearing electrode caps, looking directly at the camera with expressions ranging from fearful to vacant. One photograph showed Nicholas. I compared it to his current appearance, accounting for age, and the match was undeniable. He couldn't have been more than 12 in the photo. He was sitting in what looked like a modified dentist's chair, metal bands around his head, wires running to equipment out of frame. A man in a white coat stood beside him, face partially visible, making notes on a clipboard. On the back of the photograph, written in black ink, Project Phoenix, Subject 01, June 79. Another photograph showed a room that had been damaged, equipment overturned, scorch marks on walls, and in one corner, barely visible but unmistakable, a shape. Large, dark, with the angles that hurt to look at. The photograph was blurry in that area, as if the image couldn't quite resolve, but you could see enough to know it wasn't human, wasn't normal. The more I stared at it, the more details emerged. Surfaces that seemed to exist in multiple planes simultaneously. Limbs, if they could be called that, extending in directions that violated three-dimensional geometry, and something that might have been eyes or mouths or wounds in reality itself. "That's what I made," Nicholas said quietly, not looking at the photograph. "That's what came through when they pushed my abilities too far. They wanted me to create specific things, images they projected into my mind. But that time, something else came instead. Something that was already there, waiting for a door to open. There were dozens more photographs, test chambers, equipment I couldn't identify, children in various states of distress, and in several images that shape in the corner always partially visible, as if it existed just out of frame no matter how the camera was positioned. There were also documents, internal memos from Brookhaven, equipment requisitions for items that made no sense in conventional research, magnetic field generators beyond anything commercially available, isolation chambers, sensory deprivation tanks, and something described only as temporal variance monitors. One memo, dated March 1981, referenced continued coordination with Eastern Defence operations and noted promising developments in consciousness projection protocols. It was signed by a name I recognised, a Brookhaven physicist who'd later become prominent in quantum mechanics research. He's still alive, still publishing papers. I tried to contact him. He refused to speak with me. Another document was a technical specification for something called the Beacon, described as a trans-temporal signalling device, designed to maintain coherent communication across temporal discontinuities. The description was dense with physics jargon I barely understood, but the implication was clear. They were trying to send signals through time. But the most disturbing item in Nicholas's collection was a VHS tape. The label, handwritten, read, Temporal Test B, August 83. We found a pawn shop that still had a working VCR and paid the owner to let us use it. Nicholas, myself, and the shop owner watched together on an old television in the back room. The video quality was poor, degraded by age and magnetic drift. But what it showed was unmistakable. A white-walled room exactly as Nicholas had described. Harsh fluorescent lighting, equipment lining the walls, old computers with CRT monitors, oscilloscopes, devices I couldn't identify. In the centre, a chair, metal frame, leather straps, a helmet covered with sensors and wires. A boy, maybe 13 years old, was led into the frame by two men in white coats. The boy was Nicholas. Even 40 years younger, even moving differently, the resemblance was clear. They strapped him into the chair, attached the helmet. One technician spoke off camera, words muffled but the tone clear, instructions, commands, pushing the boy to concentrate. For several minutes nothing happened. The boy sat still, eyes closed, face straining with effort. The monitoring equipment showed readings I couldn't interpret, numbers and waveforms changing rapidly. Then the air around the boy began to shimmer. At first it was subtle, heat waves, distortions in the light, but quickly it became more pronounced. The shimmer intensified, localized in a corner of the room, and began to coalesce into something. A shape, dark, indistinct, but growing more solid with each passing second. The technicians noticed. One stepped back, another reached for a control panel. Someone off camera shouted, "Increase the dampening field!" But the shape continued to form. It was large, easily 8 feet tall with proportions that weren't quite right. Too long in some dimensions, compressed in others. Surfaces that reflected light impossibly, showing angles that geometry said couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. And it was moving, not smoothly. It stuttered, as if existence itself was struggling to contain it. Frame by frame, it grew more present, more real, forcing its way into our reality like something being born through too small an opening. The boy was screaming now. I could see his mouth open, tendons standing out in his neck, but the audio on the tape was distorted, overwhelmed by a sound that wasn't quite sound, more a pressure that made the speakers crackle and pop. The creature turned. It had something that might have been a head, might have been multiple heads. Impossible to tell because the surfaces shifted and merged, and it looked at the camera. The shop owner made a sound of horror. "What the hell is that?" On the screen, chaos. Technicians running. Alarms blaring. The boy still strapped in the chair, body convulsing. Equipment sparking. And the creature growing larger, more solid, reaching out with appendages that left trails of darkness in their wake. One technician didn't run fast enough. The creature touched him. Just a brief contact, a brushing of whatever passed for its hand against the man's back. The technician collapsed instantly, body rigid, mouth open in a scream we couldn't hear over the distorted audio. Then someone hit a switch. The lights in the room strobed, faster and faster, and the creature began to break apart. Not dissolving naturally, but being torn, shredded by forces I couldn't see. It resisted, writhing, reaching for anything it could grasp, but piece by piece it was pulled back, sucked into whatever dimensional wound it had emerged from. The video cut to static. When it came back, seconds later, the room was empty except for the boy still in the chair. Unconscious or dead, it was impossible to tell. Technicians rushed in, some wearing what looked like hazmat suits, others just lab coats. They unstrapped the boy, carried him out of frame. The last thing visible before the tape ended was the technician who'd been touched by the creature. He was still on the floor, but moving now, crawling. His movements were wrong, joints bending in directions they shouldn't, as if he'd forgotten how human bodies worked. Someone off camera said, "Get him to containment and shut down the chair. We're done for tonight." The tape ended. We sat in silence for a long time. The shop owner finally spoke. "That's not real. It can't be real. Special effects, right? Some kind of movie?" But we all knew it wasn't. The quality was wrong for special effects. The reactions were too genuine, and the tape itself had markings that identified it as military property. On the back of the VHS tape, stamped in official military typeface, "Property of United States Air Force Phenomenon Division. Do not duplicate." Phenomenon Division. Not a unit I'd ever heard of. Not in any official Air Force documentation I could find. But there it was, stamped on a tape showing an experiment that wasn't supposed to have happened at a facility that was supposedly abandoned. We made a digital copy of the tape. Nicholas gave me all his documents, photographs and evidence. He made me promise to publish the story no matter what happened. "They'll come for this," he said. "They'll know someone has it. They've probably known all along. I think they let me keep it. Let me be a walking storage system for evidence, watching to see if I'd ever try to expose it. Now I am, so they'll come." Then why do it? Why now? Because I'm dying anyway. And because that thing in the video, it's not gone. It's still partially here, caught, between dimensions. And they're trying to bring it through again. I can feel it. Every 19 days when the equipment cycles, I feel it reaching. Trying to come back. And one day, they'll succeed. One day, they'll open that door wide enough, and it will come through. And this time, they won't be able to close it. 2 days later, Nicholas was dead. The official cause was listed as complications from lung cancer. But he'd been stable just days before, coherent enough to show me his evidence, strong enough to travel across the city. The hospice nurse told me he'd taken a sudden turn, that a visitor had come to see him the night before he died. "Military looking," she said. "Said he was an old friend, stayed about an hour. After he left, Nicholas seemed agitated, kept saying they'd found him, kept asking me to call someone, but he couldn't remember who. The visitor signed in under a name that, when I checked, belonged to a man who'd been dead for 15 years. I tried to file a police report suggesting foul play. It went nowhere. Natural causes. End of story. The detective I spoke with was sympathetic but clear. Without evidence of a crime, there was nothing to investigate. An old man with terminal cancer had died. Tragic, but not suspicious. But I knew better. They'd found Nicholas, and they'd silenced him before he could tell anyone else what he knew. Ending. Time never closed. I spent 6 months compiling everything. The documents, the photographs, the video, Nicholas's testimony, the historical evidence, the FOIA denials that suggested an ongoing cover-up, interview transcripts with families of missing children, meteorological data from August 1983, utility records showing active systems beneath an abandoned base, testimonies from former personnel, the evaluation transcript describing the same events Nicholas had described. I wrote a comprehensive article, 20,000 words documenting the entire investigation. I laid out the evidence methodically, building from public facts to classified revelations, showing how each piece connected to the next, creating a picture of a program that had pushed the boundaries of reality and paid the price. I pitched it to major publications. All declined. The first editor told me, "This is compelling, but we can't verify the core claims. Without on-the-record sources, it's too risky. The second said, our legal team won't clear it. Too many national security implications. The third was more honest. We can't publish this. We'd have federal investigators crawling up our ass within a week. I'm sorry, but this is above our pay grade. I tried smaller outlets, alternative media, investigative journalism non-profits. Same response. Too controversial, too risky, too likely to bring down government scrutiny. So I published it myself on a dedicated website. I uploaded scans of every document, the full video, audio of my interviews with Nicholas, photographs of the underground, entrance, GPS coordinates, utility records, FOIA denials, everything. I built the site carefully with multiple layers of backup and distribution, mirrors on servers in different countries, copies shared with journalist organisations with instructions to publish if I disappeared. I wanted to make sure that even if they came for me, the information would survive. The article went live on a Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m. I watched the traffic counter, saw the numbers climb, 10 visitors, 100, 1,000. By Monday afternoon it had been shared thousands of times. By Tuesday it was trending on multiple platforms. People were discussing it, debating it, planning trips to Camp Hero to investigate for themselves. Conspiracy theory forums erupted with activity. Researchers I'd never met were verifying pieces of my evidence, confirming documents, adding their own findings. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about turning it into a film. A podcaster wanted to interview me. A book publisher offered an advance for a full manuscript. For 48 hours it felt like the truth was finally breaking through. Like decades of cover-up were crumbling. By Wednesday morning it was gone. The website was down, not just offline but erased. The domain registrar said they had no record of my purchase. My hosting company claimed the account never existed. When I showed them my payment receipts, they looked at me like I was insane. Backup files on my computer were corrupted, unrecoverable. I tried data recovery software. Nothing. The files existed, but they were filled with garbage data, as if they'd been overwritten with random noise. The cloud storage service showed no files in my account. Not deleted, just never uploaded. When I checked the upload logs, they showed activity from my IP address, but the timestamps were wrong, showing uploads from times when I was provably elsewhere, when my computer was powered off. The digital copies I'd made of Nicholas's evidence were gone. The original documents I'd scanned and kept in a safe deposit box had vanished from the box. The bank had no record of my visit to place them there, despite me having the receipt. When I showed them the receipt, they said their system had no record of that transaction number. It was as if the entire deposit had been retroactively deleted from their database. My phone record showed no calls to Nicholas. Email correspondence was gone from sent and received folders. Text messages erased. When I contacted my phone provider, they said their system showed no such communications had ever occurred. It was as if the entire investigation had been retroactively deleted from reality. People who'd shared the article reported the links dying. Screenshots they'd taken were corrupted. One person told me they'd downloaded the entire site as a PDF, but when they went to open it, the file was empty. The documentary filmmaker who'd contacted me said he didn't remember our conversation. The podcaster denied ever reaching out. The publisher said they had no record of any offer. I still had my memory. My notes written in physical notebooks still existed, though even those seemed to be fading, ink becoming lighter, words becoming harder to read, as if even physical records were being erased. I'm writing this now, as fast as I can, getting it down before it too disappears. I don't know how long this will last, how long before this file corrupts, this document vanishes, this story becomes something I can no longer prove existed. But here's the thing that keeps me awake, the thing I can't explain. This morning I received a package, no return address, no postage mark, just left outside my door. Inside was Nicholas's notebook, the original one he'd given me in that Brooklyn coffee shop. But when I opened it, all the pages were blank, every entry, every coordinate, every name erased, not torn out, not written over. Just blank, as if they'd never been written on at all. Except for one page, the last page. It had a timestamp that wasn't there before. August 12th, 1983. We're still in the loop, and underneath, in handwriting that might have been mine, time doesn't forget, neither does the chair. It's still running. We never left. We're still down there, and you're starting to remember. I don't remember writing that. I know I didn't. But the handwriting is mine. Exactly mine. The way I form letters, the pressure I use, the spacing. It's my hand that wrote those words. But when? Yesterday I drove out to Camp Hero. I had to see it again. Had to confirm it still existed. Maybe everything else had been erased, but the place itself couldn't be deleted. The steel door I'd found was gone, not sealed, not removed. Gone, as if it had never existed. Just solid concrete where I knew I'd found an entrance. I checked the GPS coordinates. I was in the right place. But there was no door, no lock, nothing. I put my hand on the ground anyway, pressing against the concrete, and I felt it. That pulse, that rhythmic throb of machinery running deep below, the same rhythm I'd felt months ago. Proof that something was still down there, still running. And for just a moment, I remembered being in a white room, sitting in a metal chair, wires attached to my head, someone asking me to think of something specific, someone pushing me to open a door. The memory was vivid, more than a dream, more than an imagination, a memory of something that actually happened. But that's impossible. I was born in 1985. The MONTAUK project supposedly ended in 83. I couldn't have been there, unless time doesn't work the way we think it does, unless the project found a way to create loops, fold moments back on themselves, trap people in recursive timelines, unless everyone who investigates too deeply gets pulled into the loop, becomes part of the experiment retroactively. Nicholas told me once, in one of our last conversations, the worst part isn't that they experimented on us, it's that we never left. We're still there, in that moment, and anyone who looks too closely gets pulled in. The chair doesn't just affect those who sit in it. It affects anyone who thinks about it too deeply, who focuses too much attention on what happened. Consciousness is entangled with the experiment now. We're all part of it. I'm starting to understand what he meant. If you're listening to this, if you're hearing these words, be careful. Some doors open both ways. Some investigations don't end when you close the file. By learning about the MONTAUK project, by thinking about what happened there, you might be creating a connection. Consciousness and quantum mechanics are linked in ways we don't understand. Observation affects reality. And if the experiments at MONTAUK really did bridge consciousness and time, then maybe just knowing about it is enough to get caught in the loop. Camp Hero still stands. The radar tower still rises against the sky. And beneath the ground, in tunnels the government says don't exist, something is still running. Every 19 days, like clockwork, the equipment cycles. The electromagnetic fields activate. The beacon at the end of time transmits its signal into the past, into the future, into all moments simultaneously. Time doesn't forget. Neither does the chair. And now, neither will you. Because once you know about the MONTAUK project, once you've read this far, you're part of it. Your consciousness has touched the experiment. You've opened a door in your own mind, and that door connects back to the white room beneath Camp Hero. The beacon at the end of time is still transmitting. The signal never stopped. We're all receiving it, whether we know it or not. And somewhere, in a white room beneath Camp Hero, a boy is sitting in a chair. Always sitting. Always broadcasting. Always opening doors that should have stayed closed. The year is 1983. The year is 2014. The year is now. All of them. Simultaneously. Because time in that place doesn't move forward anymore. It loops. And loops. And loops. Forever. And we're all in the loop now. All of us who know the story. All of us who've thought about what happened there. We're all trapped in that moment beneath Camp Hero, experiencing it from different angles, different timelines, but always circling back to the same point. The boy in the chair, the thing that came through, the door that won't close. I'm writing this from a motel room in Montauk. I came back here, though I don't remember deciding to. I keep finding myself driving out to the park, standing over the spot where the door used to be, feeling that pulse through the ground. Last night I woke up in the middle of the night. I was standing outside in my bare feet halfway to Camp Hero. I don't remember getting out of bed. Don't remember leaving the room. I'm going back to the facility today. I found another entrance, or it found me, or I remembered it from the timeline where I was part of the project. I can't tell anymore. There's a door in my dreams, a white door in a white room. And it's opening, and something on the other side knows my name. This is the last entry I'll make. The last thing I'll write before I go down into those tunnels one final time. If you're reading this, then it means the document survived. The story escaped the loop, at least partially. Share it, save it, copy it, let it spread. But know that by doing so, you're perpetuating the experiment. You're keeping the door open. You're feeding attention and consciousness into the machine beneath Camp Hero. And maybe that's what they want. Maybe the whole point was to create a self-perpetuating cycle. A story that spreads itself, pulling more and more people into the loop, their consciousness entangling with the experiment, creating more fuel for the chair. The beacon at the end of time broadcasts to anyone listening. And if you've made it this far, you're listening. Welcome to the loop. We've been waiting for you. We've always been waiting. Time doesn't forget. Neither does the chair. Neither do we. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I want to give a thank you to Nomacy Foscamas for suggesting this story concept. Your ideas help make sleep theories what it is today. If you have your own story suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more spine-tingling content that will keep you up at night. What lies beyond the forbidden line in Antarctica? Some boundaries exist for reasons we're never meant to understand. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw beneath the ice, and why they'll never let me tell anyone about it. I used to be somebody in the mountaineering world. Spent 15 years conquering peaks that most people only see in documentaries. The Andes, the Himalayas. Places where the air gets so thin you can taste death with every breath. I had sponsors, magazine covers, speaking engagements. Then came the incident on Everest. 3 climbers died because of a decision I made, and suddenly my name became poison in the climbing community. That's how I ended up in a dingy office in Christchurch, New Zealand, staring at a contract from Meridian Logistics. They needed an experienced mountaineer to guide a survey team in Antarctica. Weather station installations, they said. Scientific equipment placement. Nothing dangerous, nothing complicated. Just use my expertise to keep their people alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The money was good. Too good for what they claimed was simple work, but I was broke, blacklisted, and running out of options. I signed the papers without reading the fine print. I should have read the fine print. 3 days later, I was on a cargo plane headed for the bottom of the world, watching the last traces of civilization disappear beneath a blanket of endless white. The other passengers were quiet, professional types who avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers. Government contractors, maybe. Or worse. We landed at McMurdo Base as the Antarctic summer was beginning to fade. Even in the relatively warm season, the cold hit me like a physical blow when the cargo doors opened. But it wasn't just the temperature that made me shiver, it was the silence. Antarctica doesn't just lack sound, it devours it. Every word, every footstep, every breath gets swallowed by the infinite white void. Commander Hayes met me at the landing strip. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of staring at snow. His handshake was firm but brief, as if he didn't want to waste time on pleasantries. "You're our mountain expert," he said, leading me toward a cluster of prefab buildings. "Your job is simple. Keep the science team alive while they do their work. We go out in 2 days." "What kind of scientific work?" I asked. Hayes paused mid-step. "Weather stations. Climate monitoring. Standard stuff." It wasn't the answer that bothered me. It was the way he delivered it, like he was reciting lines from a script. But I kept my mouth shut. I was being paid to guide, not to ask questions. That evening I sat in the mess hall picking at a plate of reconstituted beef stew and listening to the conversations around me. Most of it was typical base chatter, complaints about the food, speculation about weather patterns, gossip about personnel rotations. But then I caught something that made my blood run cold. 2 officers sat at a table near the wall, speaking in low voices. I couldn't make out most of their conversation, but one phrase came through crystal clear. Another team didn't come back, not a single trace. I turned to look at them, but they were already standing, clearing their trays. As they walked past my table, one of them glanced at me with an expression I couldn't read. Warning? Pity? Fear? Later that night, lying in my narrow bunk, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself I'd misheard. Teams went missing in Antarctica all the time. Equipment failures, weather emergencies, simple human error in an environment that forgave nothing. Didn't have to mean anything sinister. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, I dreamed of endless white horizons and voices calling from beneath the ice. The next morning, Hayes briefed the team in a conference room that smelled like coffee and diesel fuel. There were 6 of us total, Hayes as team leader, myself as mountain guide, 2 scientists named Martinez and Volkov, a communications specialist called Jackson, and a supply coordinator named Thompson. Hayes spread a map across the table, marking our route with a red pen. "We'll be travelling roughly 200 kilometres southeast of here," he said. "The terrain is mostly flat ice sheets, but there are some crevasse fields we'll need to navigate carefully." He drew a thick black line across the map. "This is longitude 164 degrees east. Under no circumstances does anyone cross this line. For safety and treaty compliance, this is absolutely forbidden territory." "What's past the line?" Martinez asked. She was a young woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of pale complexion that suggested she spent most of her time in laboratories. "Nothing that concerns us," Hayes replied curtly. "Our job is to establish monitoring stations along this route." He tapped several points on the map. 3 locations, 2 days at each site. Simple installation work. But as I studied the map, something nagged at me. The forbidden line didn't follow any natural geographical feature. No mountain ridge, no obvious hazard zone. It was perfectly straight, as if drawn by bureaucrats in an office thousands of miles away. And beyond it, the map showed nothing but blank white space. "Questions?" Hayes asked, already beginning to fold the map. I almost spoke up, almost asked about the missing team I'd overheard mentioned, but something in Hayes' expression warned me off. This wasn't a man who welcomed curiosity. "No questions," I said. The others shook their heads as well. "Good! We leave at 0600 tomorrow, get some sleep." But sleep was the last thing on my mind as I walked back to my quarters. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being sent out there for reasons that had nothing to do with weather stations, and that some of us weren't expected to come back. The convoy that left McMurdo Base the next morning looked more military than scientific. 3 tracked vehicles loaded with enough supplies for 2 weeks, plus emergency rations that could stretch to a month if needed. Hayes drove the lead vehicle, with Martinez and Volkov handling the scientific equipment. Thompson and Jackson took the supply vehicle in the middle, while I brought up the rear in the 3rd transport, alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of unease. The first day passed uneventfully. We travelled across relatively flat terrain, the vehicle's engines growling against the constant headwind. The landscape was monotonously beautiful, an endless expanse of white broken only by the occasional nunatak poking up through the ice, like a stone island in a frozen sea. By the second day, however, I began to notice something odd. I'd spent enough time at extreme latitudes to develop an intuitive sense of solar position. In Antarctica during late summer, the sun should follow a predictable arc across the sky, never getting very high, but maintaining a steady pattern. But as I drove, squinting through the tinted visor of my goggles, the sun seemed wrong. Too high, too bright for what my internal compass told me was the correct time and date. I tried to dismiss it as disorientation from the long journey and the strange sleep patterns that came with Antarctic life. But when we stopped for our midday break, I casually asked Martinez if she'd noticed anything unusual about the light. She looked up from her instruments, frowning. Actually, yes. The angle seems off for our latitude and the time of year. I was wondering if there might be some kind of atmospheric refraction effect. Could be, I said, but her confirmation made my stomach tighten. The third day brought a new concern. I'd been checking my compass regularly out of habit, using the magnetic bearing to verify our GPS heading. But as the day progressed, the needle began to drift. Slowly at first, then more dramatically. By afternoon, it was pointing almost 30 degrees off from where magnetic north should be. GPS could malfunction. Electronic equipment could fail in extreme cold. But a mechanical compass was about as reliable as navigation got, unless something was interfering with the Earth's magnetic field itself. "Hayes," I called over the radio. "Are you seeing any compass anomalies?" A long pause. "Negative. Why?" "My magnetic heading is way off GPS. Could be equipment failure." Another pause, longer this time. "Stay on GPS bearing. We'll check equipment at tonight's camp." But I noticed he didn't ask to see my compass readings, and when we stopped for the evening, he made no mention of checking anyone's equipment. The fourth day brought the most unsettling change yet. The terrain began to shift from the relatively flat ice fields we'd been crossing to something much more dramatic. Where the maps showed continued flat terrain, we encountered towering ice formations, not the chaotic jumble of pressure ridges I was used to seeing, but organised structures that looked almost artificial. Walls of ice rose 30, 40, even 50 feet high, running in perfectly straight lines across our path. We were forced to detour repeatedly, following what seemed like corridors between these frozen ramparts. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, as if they'd been carved rather than formed by natural processes. "Pressure ridges," Martinez suggested during one of our stops, but she didn't sound convinced. "I've never seen pressure ridges this regular," I replied. "It's like someone built fortifications out of ice." Volkov, the older of the two scientists, had been quiet for most of the journey, but now he spoke up, his Russian accent thick with concern. "In Siberia, we have stories of such things. Ice that builds itself into walls and towers, but they are just stories." "What kind of stories?" I asked. But before Volkov could answer, Hayes' voice crackled over the radio. "Mount up. We're burning daylight." As we drove deeper into this maze of ice walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, guided along a specific path by someone or something that wanted us to go in a particular direction. The walls created a definite corridor leading southeast, toward the forbidden line that Hayes had marked on his map. By evening we were completely enclosed by the ice formations. They towered above us on all sides, creating a narrow valley that blocked out most of the sky. The walls glowed with an eerie blue light in the perpetual twilight, and our voices echoed strangely in the enclosed space. "This isn't on any map," I told Hayes as we set up camp. "Antarctic topography changes," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "Ice shifts, new formations appear all the time." But I'd studied enough glaciology to know that wasn't how ice worked. These walls were old, carved by processes I couldn't begin to understand, and they were leading us somewhere specific. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind howl through the ice corridor, I heard something else beneath the sound of the storm. A low, rhythmic booming like distant thunder or a massive heartbeat. It seemed to come from deep beneath the ice, pulsing up through the frozen ground. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound faded away. When I checked my watch, it was just past midnight, though in Antarctica's endless twilight, time became almost meaningless. I was beginning to suspect that we weren't just approaching the forbidden line. We were being drawn toward it by forces that had nothing to do with weather stations or scientific research. And somewhere in the ice walls around us, I had the growing certainty that we were being watched. The booming sound returned just before dawn. I was awake instantly, every mountaineering instinct screaming danger. The sound was deeper than thunder, more sustained than an avalanche. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ice walls that surrounded our camp. The others felt it too. I could see lights moving in the other tents as people fumbled for flashlights and gear. Hayes was the first to emerge, his rifle slung across his shoulder, which was interesting, since he'd never mentioned weapons during our briefing. "Equipment check," he barked. "Everyone up. Now." We broke camp in record time, loading the vehicles while the echo of that mysterious boom still seemed to hang in the air. But as we prepared to continue southeast, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ice walls had changed during the night. The corridor that had led us here was now partially blocked by a fresh formation of ice, as if the walls had grown while we slept. But more disturbing was what lay ahead. The passage continued, but it was wider now, as if something had carved out more space for us to travel. "Natural ice movement," Hayes said when I pointed it out, but his hand never left his rifle. We drove in tense silence for the first few hours. The ice walls gradually receded, opening into a broader valley between towering formations, but the landscape ahead remained wrong. Hills where the maps showed flat ground, valleys that shouldn't exist, and always that sense of being guided along a predetermined path. It was Martinez who first spotted the crack. "Stop," she called over the radio, "there's something ahead." We pulled up about 50 metres from what looked like a shadow across the ice, but as we approached on foot, I realised it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a fissure in the ice sheet, running perpendicular to our path. The crack was maybe 3 feet wide, but I couldn't see the bottom even when I shone my flashlight into the depths. "Fresh break," I observed, examining the edges. The ice was clean and sharp, not weathered by wind and time. "This opened recently." "How recently?" Hayes asked. I knelt down and touched the edge of the crack. There were stress patterns in the ice that told a story. Sudden, violent separation caused by enormous forces from below. Hours, maybe. Could have been what caused that booming sound. But as I played my light along the fissure, I noticed something that made me pause. There was air movement coming up from the depths. Not the dead, still air you'd expect from a simple crack in the ice sheet, but a warm breeze that carried scents I couldn't identify. "There's airflow," I reported, "and it's warm." Volkov knelt beside me and held his hand over the crack. His eyes widened. "This is not possible. Below ice sheet should be more ice, or rock, nothing that creates warm air." Hayes ordered us back to the vehicles, but I lingered at the edge of the fissure. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness below, I could make out shapes in the depths. Not just ice and rock, but something else. Dark surfaces that reflected my flashlight beam, and far below, so distant I might have been imagining it, a faint greenish glow. "Move out," Hayes called. But as we loaded back into the vehicles, I kept thinking about that warm breeze and the impossible glow from the depths. In 15 years of extreme environment experience, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts were telling me that we'd found something that wasn't supposed to exist. We spent the day detouring around the fissure, following its edge as it curved away to the southeast. The crack ran for kilometres without seeming to narrow or close. Occasionally I caught glimpses of that strange glow from the depths, always too distant and faint to be certain of what I was seeing. By evening we'd travelled nearly 20 kilometres along the fissure's edge without finding a way across. Hayes called a halt as the perpetual twilight deepened, and we made camp on a flat section of ice about 100 metres from the crack. "Tomorrow we find a way round," Hayes announced during our brief evening meal. "Mission parameters haven't changed." But I could see the tension in everyone's faces. Whatever we'd stumbled onto, it wasn't part of any weather station installation plan. As the others settled into their tents, I found myself drawn back to the edge of the fissure. The warm air was still flowing up from the depths, and now I could smell it more clearly. Not the sterile cold of Antarctic air, but something organic, almost alive, like moss and earth and growing things, impossible as that seemed. I was about to return to my tent when I heard voices, not from our camp, from below. I dropped to my belly and crawled to the very edge of the crack, listening intently. At first I thought it might be echoes from our own group, sound bouncing strangely off the ice walls. But the voices were too distant, too muffled, and they had a cadence that didn't match any language I recognised. As I strained to listen, a gust of warm air brought up something else, the scent of wood smoke and cooking food. Somewhere down in that impossible darkness, people were living their lives around fires and meals, as if the frozen wasteland above didn't exist. I was so focused on listening that I almost missed the light moving along the opposite edge of the fissure. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible in the twilight, but as I watched, it resolved into what looked like a torch or lantern, moving steadily along the far side of the crack. I couldn't make out who or what was carrying it, but the light moved with purpose, as if someone was patrolling the edges of their hidden world. The light paused directly across from where I lay. For a long moment it remained motionless, and I had the unsettling feeling that whoever held it was looking directly at me. Then it began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I crawled back from the edge and returned to my tent, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that distant light, and wondered what kind of people could survive in the depths beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. And more importantly, what they might do if they discovered we were up here, listening to their voices and watching their movements in the dark. I woke to the sound of arguing. Hayes and Jackson were standing near the vehicles, their voices low but heated. I couldn't make out the words, but their body language spoke volumes. Jackson was gesturing emphatically toward the fissure, while Hayes kept shaking his head and pointing southeast, in the direction of our original route. By the time I emerged from my tent, the argument had ended, but the tension remained. Jackson avoided eye contact during our brief breakfast, and Hayes seemed more agitated than usual, constantly checking his watch and the GPS unit. "Change of plans," Hayes announced as we finished eating. "We're abandoning the southeastern route." New orders came through during the night. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Our communications equipment had been acting up for days, and I'd seen no evidence of any incoming transmissions, but no one called him on it. "Where are we headed?" Martinez asked. Hayes consulted his map, though I suspected he already knew exactly where we were going. "Northwest, back toward the main research corridor. We'll establish monitoring stations along a modified route. Northwest would take us away from the fissure and whatever lay beneath it, away from the warm air and distant voices and impossible green glow." Part of me felt relieved. Mountaineering had taught me when to retreat from dangerous situations. But another part, the part that had driven me to climb the world's most dangerous peaks, rebelled against walking away from the greatest mystery I'd ever encountered. We packed up camp efficiently, but I noticed that Jackson and Thompson were moving more slowly than usual, finding excuses to linger near the edge of the fissure. They'd heard the voices too, or seen the lights, or simply sensed that we were on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. As we loaded the vehicles, Thompson approached me. He was a quiet man in his 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his career handling gear in extreme conditions. "You've been listening," he said quietly. "Down there. What did you hear?" I glanced around to make sure Hayes wasn't in earshot. People. Living people. Down in that crack. Thompson nodded grimly. "Jackson thinks so too. We've been talking about it." "Talking about what?" "About what happens if we just drive away and pretend we never found this place." He looked toward the fissure, where the warm air was still rising in visible columns in the cold morning air. How do we live with ourselves knowing we found something like this and just left? It was a question I'd been asking myself all night. But before I could answer, Hayes was shouting for everyone to mount up. We drove northwest for 3 hours, putting the fissure behind us. But the landscape remained wrong. Too many hills, too many valleys, ice formations that shouldn't exist according to any map. It was as if we'd crossed into a different version of Antarctica. one where the normal rules of geography no longer applied. During our midday stop, Hayes spread out his map and began marking locations for the monitoring stations. But I could see that his hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes kept drifting back toward the southeast where we'd left the fissure behind. "First station here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that looked identical to every other spot. "We'll establish base camp and begin installation tomorrow." But Jackson wasn't looking at the map. He was staring back the way we'd come, where a thin column of warm air was still visible on the horizon like a distant smoke signal. "We need to go back," he said suddenly. Hayes looked up sharply. "What?" "That fissure. Whatever's down there, as we can't just ignore it. This could be the discovery of the century." "Our job is weather stations," Hayes replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Jackson. "Our job is supposed to be weather stations," Thompson added quietly, "but we all know this mission was never about weather stations." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes stared at the two men, and I could see him weighing his options. He had authority, but authority only worked when people were willing to follow, and it was becoming clear that his team was having second thoughts about abandoning the greatest mystery any of us had ever encountered. "The mission parameters are non-negotiable," Hayes said finally. "Then maybe it's time to renegotiate," Jackson replied. That evening, as Hayes set up our camp in another anonymous stretch of ice, Thompson approached me again. This time Martinez was with him. "We're going back," Thompson said without preamble. "Tonight. You're the mountain expert. We need your help." "Hayes won't authorize it," I pointed out. "Hayes doesn't need to know," Martinez said. "We slip out after he's asleep, rappel down into that fissure, and see what's really down there. A few hours, that's all. By morning, we're back here and no one's the wiser." It was insane. Rappelling into an unknown crack in the ice, in the middle of Antarctic night, without proper backup or communication with base camp. Every rule of safe expedition practice said to walk away, but I thought about those distant voices and the impossible warmth rising from the depths. I thought about 15 years of climbing mountains because they were there, of pushing into places where humans weren't meant to go. "What about equipment?" I asked. Thompson smiled grimly. "Already taken care of. Ropes, harnesses, lights, emergency supplies, everything we need for a basic reconnaissance. If Hayes finds out..." "Let us worry about Hayes," Martinez said. "Are you in?" I looked back toward the southeast, where that column of warm air was still faintly visible against the starless sky. In all my years of extreme exploration, I'd never walked away from a mystery this big, and if I did walk away now, I knew I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what we'd left behind in that crack in the ice. "I'm in," I said. 3 hours later, while Hayes and Volkov slept in their tents, 3 figures slipped away from camp and began the long trek back toward the fissure. We moved quietly across the ice, guided by GPS and the distant column of warm air that marked our destination like a beacon. By the time we reached the edge of the crack, it was nearly midnight, though in Antarctica's endless twilight, time was becoming meaningless. The fissure yawned before us, black and mysterious, with that impossible warm breeze still rising from its depths. I set up the anchor points while Thompson and Martinez prepared the ropes. My hands shook slightly as I tested the hardware, not from cold, but from the magnitude of what we were about to do. We were about to descend into a place that shouldn't exist to meet people who shouldn't be there. "Last chance to change your minds," I said as I clipped into my harness. Neither of them hesitated. "Let's go see what's down there," Thompson said. And with that, we stepped over the edge and began our descent into the impossible. The descent took longer than expected. What had looked like a simple crack from the surface revealed itself to be a complex system of interconnected fissures and chambers. The walls were smooth ice for the first 30 meters, but as we rappelled deeper, the ice gave way to exposed rock. Dark stone that looked nothing like the typical Antarctic geology I was familiar with. The warm air grew stronger as we descended, carrying with it scents that shouldn't exist in this frozen wasteland. I caught hints of vegetation, wood smoke, and something else. Something organic and alive that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "How far down do you think this goes?" Martinez whispered, her voice echoing strangely off the walls. "GPS shows we're about 60 meters below surface level," I replied, checking my instruments. but the acoustic properties suggest the chamber system extends much deeper. Thompson, rappelling on the rope beside me, suddenly stopped. "Light," he said. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. Far below us, barely visible in the darkness, was a faint greenish glow. Not reflected light from our headlamps, but something generating its own illumination. "Bioluminescence," Martinez suggested. "Maybe," I said, but I'd never heard of bioluminescent organisms surviving in Antarctica's extreme conditions. We continued our descent, moving carefully through a series of natural rock formations that created a rough staircase down through the fissure system. The walls here showed signs of modification, not recent construction, but ancient stonework that had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. "These aren't natural formations," Thompson observed, running his hand along a section of wall where the rock had been deliberately shaped. "Someone carved these passages." The stonework was crude but effective, creating handholds and ledges that made the descent easier. Whoever had carved them understood the principles of safe passage through vertical terrain. But the style was unlike anything I'd seen in my travels, neither modern nor matching any historical human civilization I was familiar with. As we descended deeper, we began to encounter artifacts. The first was a stone marker, roughly the size of a gravestone, placed on a natural ledge about 90 metres down. The surface was covered with carved symbols that looked like a mixture of pictographs and abstract geometric patterns. The carving was fresh, recent enough that the edges were still sharp and clean. "Can you read any of this?" I asked Martinez, who had some background in archaeology. She studied the symbols carefully, running her fingers over the carved lines. "It's not like any writing system I've encountered. But see this symbol here?" She pointed to a recurring mark that looked like a stylized mountain peak. "It appears multiple times. Could be a warning, or maybe a territorial marker." We photographed the stone thoroughly before continuing down. The next artifacts appeared about 20 metres deeper, tools fashioned from bone and metal, cached in natural shelters carved into the rock walls. The bone was worked smooth and polished, while the metal pieces showed signs of sophisticated forging techniques. "The metalwork is impressive," Thompson noted, examining a knife blade that gleamed despite what must have been years of exposure to the elements. "This isn't primitive technology." But it was the footprints that truly shook us. We found them preserved in a patch of softer sediment that had accumulated on a wider ledge, about 120 metres down. At first glance they looked almost human, bipedal, with what appeared to be 5 toes. But the proportions were wrong. Too long, too wide, with claw marks that suggested the owners walked on the balls of their feet, rather than flat-footed like humans. "How big would you estimate the creature that made these?" Martinez asked, kneeling beside the clearest print. I placed my boot next to the largest track for comparison. The print was nearly half again as large as my size 11 hiking boot, and significantly wider. "Big," I said, "and recent. These couldn't have been here more than a few days." The implications were staggering. We were looking at evidence of large, intelligent bipedal creatures living in a hidden ecosystem beneath Antarctica's ice sheet. Creatures that made tools, carved stone markers, and established settlements in places humans had never explored. As we continued deeper, following the warm air currents that grew stronger with every metre of descent, we began to hear sounds from below. Not the distant voices I'd detected from the surface, but closer, more immediate sounds. The creak of ropes or leather, the scrape of tools against stone, and underneath it all a low harmonic humming that seemed to come from multiple sources. "They know we're here," Thompson whispered. He was right. The sounds had a quality of alertness, of activity stirred by our presence. Whatever lived in these depths was aware of our descent and was responding to it. At 150 metres down, we reached a wider chamber where multiple fissures converged. The green glow was stronger here, emanating from phosphorescent moss, or lichen, that covered much of the rock surfaces. The air was noticeably warmer, perhaps 50 degrees Fahrenheit, an impossible temperature for this latitude and depth. But it was what we saw across the chamber that made us all freeze in place. 3 more stone markers, much larger than the first, arranged in a deliberate triangle around what appeared to be a sleeping area. Furs and woven materials were spread on the ground, with the remnants of a recent fire still glowing faintly in a circle of carefully arranged stones. Tools and implements hung from carved hooks on the walls, and dried meat or fish was suspended from the ceiling in neat rows. Someone lived here, not visited occasionally but actually made this impossible place their home. "My God," Martinez breathed, "it's a dwelling!" As we examined the living space more closely, I became aware of another sound. Not the random noise we'd been hearing, but something more organised. Musical, almost, with a rhythmic pattern that suggested communication. Horn calls echoing up from deeper in the fissure system. Long, haunting notes that seemed to carry messages between unseen listeners in the darkness below. They're signalling, I realised, warning each other that we're here. The horn calls continued for several minutes, creating a complex pattern of long and short notes that felt like a conversation between distant speakers. Then, gradually, they faded into silence. But the silence was worse than the noise. It had the quality of held breath, of predators waiting in the darkness for prey to make a wrong move. "We should go back," Martinez whispered. Part of me agreed. We'd found evidence of a hidden civilization, documented proof of intelligent life in one of Earth's most remote places. That was enough for any expedition. But another part of me, the part that had driven me to attempt impossible climbs in the world's deadliest mountains, wanted to continue. We were on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. How could we turn back now? "A little further," I said, "just to see what's below this chamber." Thompson nodded agreement, but Martinez looked uncertain. 15 more minutes, I promised. If we don't find anything significant, we turn around. It was a promise I would come to regret, because what we found in those next 15 minutes would change everything and ensure that none of us would ever be the same again. The passage beyond the inhabited chamber led through a series of natural archways carved from the living rock. The phosphorescent moss grew thicker here, providing enough light for us to see without our headlamps. The air continued to warm as we descended, and I could hear the sound of running water somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Underground river," Thompson observed. "That would explain the ecosystem down here. Geothermal activity providing heat, fresh water, maybe even mineral deposits that support plant life." But the scientific explanations felt inadequate as we rounded a bend in the passage and saw what lay ahead. The fissure system opened into a vast underground valley, so large that our lights couldn't reach the far walls. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above us, supported by natural columns of stone that had been carved and decorated with the same symbolic patterns we'd seen on the markers. But it was the floor of the valley that took our breath away. It was covered in a carpet of the moss and low-growing plants, creating a miniature ecosystem that glowed with soft bioluminescent light. A river wound through the centre of the valley, its banks lined with what looked like cultivated gardens, and scattered throughout this impossible landscape were structures, not crude shelters, but sophisticated dwellings that showed evidence of advanced construction techniques. "This is incredible," Martinez whispered. "How is any of this possible?" "The temperature down here must be nearly 70 degrees. "Geothermal vents," I said, pointing to columns of steam rising from various points around the valley. "The whole area must sit on top of an active volcanic system. That would provide heat, fresh water from melted ice, and mineral-rich soil for agriculture." But even as I offered the scientific explanation, I knew we were looking at something far more complex than a simple geothermal oasis. The level of organisation, the sophisticated architecture, the evidence of a stable civilization, this wasn't just a survival community. This was a thriving society that had existed hidden beneath the ice for God knows how long. We made our way down into the valley, moving carefully through the cultivated areas. The plants were species I didn't recognise, adapted for low-light conditions but obviously providing food and materials for the inhabitants. Some looked like root vegetables, others resembled grains or fruits. All of them showed signs of careful cultivation and selective breeding. The dwellings were even more impressive up close. Built from carved stone and what appeared to be some kind of organic mortar, they were circular structures with conical roofs that reminded me of traditional African or Celtic architecture. Each was decorated with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories, hunting scenes, astronomical observations, and recurring images of the ice world above. "Look at this," Thompson called softly from near one of the larger structures. "These carvings show the surface. They know what's up there." The relief carvings depicted the ice sheets, the distant mountains, and even what looked like modern vehicles or aircraft. Whoever lived here wasn't isolated from the outside world. They were actively observing it. As we moved deeper into the settlement, I began to notice signs of recent activity everywhere. Fire pits with warm ashes, tools left casually on work surfaces, food preparation areas that showed evidence of recent use. The inhabitants hadn't fled at our approach. They had simply withdrawn. "Where is everyone?" Martinez whispered. It was a good question. The settlement clearly housed dozens, maybe hundreds of people, but we hadn't seen a single living soul since beginning our descent. The horn calls we'd heard earlier had gone silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet that felt like the hush before a storm. We were examining a particularly elaborate dwelling near the centre of the settlement when Thompson grabbed my arm. "Movement!" he hissed. "On the ridge!" I looked where he was pointing and felt my blood run cold. A figure stood silhouetted against the phosphorescent glow on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. Tall and imposing, wrapped in what appeared to be furs or heavy cloth, with a face painted or masked in white that seemed to glow in the strange light. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound. It was simply watching us. "How long has it been there?" Martinez whispered. "I don't know," Thompson replied. "It could have been watching us since we entered the valley." As we stared up at the silent watcher, more figures began to appear on the surrounding ridges. They emerged from concealment like ghosts, materializing from shadows and rocky overhangs until we were surrounded by dozens of motionless observers. All tall, all wrapped in furs, all with those unsettling white faces that seemed to float in the darkness. "Nobody move," I said quietly. No sudden movements, no aggressive gestures. But even as I spoke, I was calculating distances and escape routes. We were in the bottom of a valley with limited exits, surrounded by unknown numbers of potentially hostile inhabitants. Our ropes were 200 metres above us, assuming we could even reach the chamber where we'd started our descent. For several minutes we stood frozen in a bizarre standoff. The watchers made no move to approach, but they also showed no signs of leaving. They simply observed us with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if they were studying every detail of our appearance and behaviour. Then, without any visible signal, one of the figures on the central ridge raised its arm and pointed, not at us, but back toward the passage we'd used to enter the valley. The gesture was unmistakable. "Leave." "I think they want us to go," Martinez said unnecessarily. "The question is what happens if we don't," Thompson replied. As if in response to his words, more figures appeared on the ridges. Not just dozens now, but what looked like hundreds, emerging from concealment in the rocks and behind the settlement structures. They still made no threatening moves, but the message was clear. We were vastly outnumbered, and our welcome had expired. "We should respect their wishes," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to stay and try to make contact. This was the discovery of the century, proof of a hidden civilization that had survived in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Walking away now felt like abandoning the greatest opportunity in human history. But I'd spent 15 years in situations where good judgment meant the difference between life and death, and my judgment was telling me that we were moments away from a confrontation we couldn't win. "Back to the passage," I said, slowly, no threatening moves. We began to retreat, moving carefully through the settlement with hundreds of silent watchers tracking our every step. The figures on the ridges remained motionless, but I could sense movement in our peripheral vision. More inhabitants emerging from the structures around us, following our progress through their hidden world. As we reached the passage that led back to the upper chambers, I risked one look back at the settlement. What I saw made my skin crawl. The valley floor was now filled with figures. They had emerged from every dwelling, every shadow, every concealed position, until the entire settlement was alive with silent observers. Men, women, children, an entire civilization that had been watching us from the moment we entered their domain. And in their absolute silence, in their complete stillness, there was something far more menacing than any overt threat could have been. "Move," I said urgently, and we began our hasty retreat toward the surface. But as we climbed back through the carved passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that our visit had changed something fundamental. We had been witnessed, catalogued, assessed, and somewhere in those silent watching faces, decisions were being made that would have consequences far beyond our ability to imagine. The inhabitants of the hidden valley now knew that the surface world had found them. The question was what they intended to do about it. The climb back to the inhabited chamber felt endless. Our headlamps cut through darkness that seemed thicker than before, and every shadow looked like it might conceal a pursuing figure. The silence was oppressive, no sound except our own breathing and the scrape of our boots against stone. "Are they following us?" Martinez whispered during a brief rest on one of the carved ledges. I listened carefully, straining to hear any evidence of pursuit. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint whisper of air currents through the fissure system. Then I caught it. A soft sound, like leather against stone, coming from somewhere below us in the darkness. "Yes," I said. "Keep moving." We climbed faster, abandoning stealth for speed, but the sounds of pursuit grew closer, not the heavy footfalls you'd expect from people climbing after us, but something more subtle. Whispered communications in a language that sounded like wind through rock formations. The scrape of tools or weapons against stone, and underneath it all, a rhythmic sound that took me several minutes to identify. Drums. They were using drums to coordinate their movements, passing signals through the fissure system with low, resonant beats that our presence almost masked. "They're not just following us," Thompson realised. "They're organising." Getting ahead of us. He was right. The drum signals were coming from multiple directions now, including passages that branched off from our route. Whatever pursuit force was tracking us, they knew these tunnels far better than we did, and they were using that knowledge to surround us. We reached the inhabited chamber where we'd found the dwelling, but it was no longer empty. Fresh torches burned in wall sconces that hadn't been lit during our descent, and the sleeping furs had been disturbed. Someone had been here recently, possibly was still here, hidden in the shadows beyond our headlamp beams. "Don't stop," I urged. "Keep climbing." But as we prepared to continue up toward the surface, Martinez suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. The drum signals had stopped. The whispered communications had ceased. Even the sound of movement through the passages below us had fallen silent. The only thing we could hear was the sound of our own breathing, unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "They're waiting for something," Thompson said. Before anyone could respond, the torches in the chamber began to go out one by one, plunging us back into the darkness of our headlamps. But in that brief moment before the last torch died, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, multiple figures positioned around the chamber watching our every move. "Go," I said. "Now." We scrambled up the carved passages as fast as we dared, using our headlamps to navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain. Behind us, I could hear the sound of movement resuming, not hurried but purposeful. Our pursuers weren't panicking or rushing to catch us. They were herding us, driving us towards some predetermined destination. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't escaping. We were being guided. The inhabitants of the valley had let us discover their settlement, had allowed us to retreat, and were now directing our route back to the surface. But why? As we climbed higher, approaching the point where we'd cached our rappelling equipment, I began to understand. The warm air currents that had drawn us into the fissure system were still flowing, but they'd changed direction. Instead of rising from the depths, they now seemed to be flowing horizontally, as if being artificially directed through the passage system. They're manipulating the airflow, I realised, herding us like sheep. The implications were terrifying. If the inhabitants could control air currents throughout the fissure system, they possessed technology far more sophisticated than their primitive-appearing tools and dwellings suggested. We weren't dealing with a simple, isolated community. We were confronting a civilization with capabilities we didn't understand. We reached our rappelling station to find that our equipment had been disturbed. The ropes were still anchored, but they'd been examined, tested, and carefully rearranged. Someone had been here while we were exploring the valley, studying our gear with the same intensity we'd brought to examining their tools and dwellings. "They know exactly what we're capable of," Thompson said grimly. "They've been watching us since we started the descent." As we prepared to rappel back to the surface, the sounds of pursuit resumed below us. But now they were different, more urgent, more coordinated. The whispered communications became a constant stream, and I could hear the sound of multiple groups moving through the passages beneath us. "They're converging on this position," Martinez observed. I clipped into my harness and started up the rope, but something felt wrong. The anchor points we'd set were solid, tested to support much more weight than our group represented, but as I climbed, I could feel vibrations in the rope that suggested movement above us. "Someone's up there," I called down to the others. The surface, which had represented safety and escape, might now be as dangerous as the depths we were fleeing. We were trapped between unknown pursuers below and equally unknown threats above, but we had no choice. Staying in the fissure system meant certain confrontation with inhabitants who outnumbered us by hundreds to one. At least on the surface, we had our vehicles and the possibility of escape. I reached the top of the fissure and immediately knew something was wrong. Our tracks in the snow had been obliterated, not by wind, but by careful brushwork that left the surface looking untouched. Someone had been covering our trail, eliminating evidence of our presence. As Thompson and Martinez joined me on the surface, we discovered that the fissure itself had changed. Where we'd left a crack about 3 feet wide, we now found a gap barely 18 inches across. The edges showed signs of recent ice formation, as if someone had been working to seal the opening. "They're trying to close it," Martinez whispered, "hiding the entrance." But even as she spoke, we could see that the sealing work was incomplete. The fissure was narrower but still passable, and the warm air still flowed up from the depths. Whatever forces were at work below, they weren't finished with the surface world yet. As we gathered our gear and prepared to make our way back to base camp, I caught sight of movement on the horizon. Dark shapes against the white ice, too regular to be natural formations. They were moving in our direction but too distant to make out details. "Company," Thompson said, following my gaze. We had perhaps an hour's head start before whatever was tracking us across the ice would reach our position. An hour to get back to camp, convince Hayes that we'd discovered something extraordinary, and decide what to do with the most dangerous secret any of us had ever encountered. But as we began the long trek back across the ice fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The inhabitants of the hidden valley had been watching the surface world far longer than we'd been watching them. And now that contact had been made, there was no going back to the way things were before. The ice beneath Antarctica held secrets that humanity wasn't ready to face. But ready or not, those secrets were about to emerge into the light. The journey back to camp took on the quality of a nightmare. What should have been a 3-hour hike across relatively flat terrain became a desperate flight through an ice field that seemed to shift and change with every step. The dark shapes we'd spotted on the horizon were gaining ground, moving with a speed and coordination that defied explanation. Through my binoculars, I could make out individual figures, tall, fur-wrapped forms that moved across the ice with an efficiency that made our struggling progress look clumsy and amateur. "They're not using snowshoes or skis," Thompson observed during one of our brief rest stops. "How are they moving so fast?" I focused my binoculars on the nearest group of pursuers and felt my stomach clench. They weren't sinking into the snow because they weren't walking on the surface. They were using some kind of broad, flat footwear that distributed their weight so efficiently they could practically run across terrain that forced us to trudge. "Indigenous snow travel technology," I said. "Probably been perfected over centuries." But even as I offered the explanation, I knew it was inadequate. The speed and coordination of our pursuers suggested capabilities that went far beyond advanced snowshoes. They were moving like a military unit, with scouts ranging ahead and flankers maintaining precise formations. Martinez checked her GPS and swore. "We're still 4 kilometers from camp. At this rate, they'll catch us before we're halfway there." I did the math in my head and came to the same grim conclusion. Our pursuers were covering ground at nearly twice our speed, and they showed no signs of fatigue. Unless something changed dramatically, we'd be overtaken long before we could reach the safety of Hayes' camp. That's when Thompson disappeared. One moment he was trudging through the snow beside us, the next he was simply gone. No cry, no sound of struggle, no disturbance in the snow to mark where he'd been. I turned around to find Martinez and myself alone on the ice field with no sign of our missing teammate. "Thompson!" Martinez called, but her voice was immediately swallowed by the wind. I dropped to my knees and examined the snow where he'd been walking. There were his boot prints, clear and deep, leading in a straight line toward our destination. Then nothing. The prints simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted straight up into the air. "This isn't possible," Martinez whispered. But I was already scanning the surrounding terrain for any explanation. Crevasse? No, the snow showed no signs of collapse. Sinkhole? Not in this type of ice formation. The only logical conclusion was that something had taken Thompson. Silently, efficiently, and without leaving any trace. "We have to keep moving," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to search for our missing friend. "We can't just leave him." "If we stop to look, we'll all disappear," I replied, gesturing toward the horizon, where our pursuers were still gaining ground. "Whatever got Thompson is probably what's been tracking us. Our only chance is to reach camp." We resumed our desperate trek, but now every step felt like it might be our last. The ice field around us looked empty, pristine, untouched by human presence. But I knew that was an illusion. Something was out there, moving through the snow with predatory patience, waiting for the right moment to strike. The attacks, when they came, were almost anticlimactic. Martinez simply stumbled, caught herself, and looked back at me with an expression of confused surprise. "I can't... my legs," she began, then collapsed face first into the snow. I rushed to her side and found her unconscious but breathing. There were no visible injuries, no signs of violence. She'd simply stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch in her brain. As I knelt beside her, trying to determine what had happened, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Whistling. Not the wind, but a human sound, coming from somewhere nearby in the apparently empty ice field. I looked up to find myself surrounded. They had emerged from the snow itself, rising like ghosts from concealed positions that I would have sworn were empty moments before. Tall figures wrapped in white furs that perfectly matched the surrounding terrain, with faces painted or masked in patterns that made them nearly invisible against the ice and shadow. The closest figure was perhaps 10 feet away, standing motionless with what appeared to be a carved bone implement in one hand. Others were positioned in a rough circle around me, equally still, equally silent. They had been hunting us with the patience of apex predators, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. I raised my hands slowly, making no sudden movements. In my years of extreme environment travel, I'd encountered isolated communities before. Most were suspicious of outsiders, but could be reasoned with if you showed proper respect. But these weren't curious locals wondering about strangers in their territory. These were soldiers, disciplined and organised, who had been tracking us with military precision. And the implement in the nearest figure's hand wasn't a tool, it was a weapon. The whistling sound came again, and I realised it was a form of communication. The figures around me were coordinating their movements with the same kind of tactical precision I'd seen in special forces operations. "We mean no harm," I said, though I doubted they understood English. "We're leaving. Going back to our camp." The nearest figure tilted its head slightly, studying me with an intensity that was almost physical. Then it raised the bone implement and pointed, not at me, but toward Martinez's unconscious form. The message was clear, she was coming with them. "No," I said, moving to stand protectively over Martinez. "She stays with me." The figure's response was swift and decisive. It made a sharp gesture and something struck me in the neck. Not painful, but startling. I reached up to find a small dart made from carved bone and what felt like organic fibres. The world began to blur at the edges. My vision narrowed, and my legs felt like they were made of water. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was the figures lifting Martinez and carrying her away across the ice, moving with the same impossible speed that had allowed them to track us across the frozen wasteland. When I woke, I was alone. The sun had moved significantly across the sky, suggesting I'd been unconscious for several hours. The snow around me showed signs of activity, many footprints, drag marks, and the aftermath of what must have been a significant operation. But Martinez was gone, along with any trace of our pursuers. I checked my GPS and found that I was less than a kilometre from Hayes' camp, close enough that I could make it on foot, assuming whatever had taken my companions didn't return for me. As I struggled to my feet, still groggy from whatever they'd used to drug me, I found something that made my heart sink. A piece of torn fabric from Thompson's jacket, partially buried in the snow, and beneath it, carved into the hard-packed ice, was one of the symbols we'd seen on the stone markers in the hidden valley. They weren't just taking prisoners. They were leaving messages, marking their territory, making it clear that the surface world was now part of their domain. I stumbled toward camp through the gathering darkness, driven by the desperate hope that Hayes would believe my story and help me mount a rescue mission. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. Thompson and Martinez were gone, taken by inhabitants of a world that wasn't supposed to exist. And somewhere beneath the ice, decisions were being made that would affect far more than just our small expedition team. The hidden valley had been discovered, its secrets exposed, and its guardians were about to make sure that exposure came with a price the surface world wasn't prepared to pay. I reached Hayes' camp just as the last light was fading from the Antarctic sky. My stumbling approach through the ice fields must have looked like the arrival of a madman. Clothes torn, face windburned, babbling about hidden civilizations and missing team members. Hayes took one look at me and immediately began barking orders. Medical check, emergency protocols, communications with base. Within an hour, I was wrapped in thermal blankets inside the command tent, sipping hot coffee while Hayes and Volkov interrogated me about what had happened. Underground valley, Hayes repeated for the third time, with inhabitants. Hundreds of them, I insisted, to maybe thousands. They have dwellings, agriculture, sophisticated technology, and they took Thompson and Martinez. Volkov exchanged a look with Hayes that I didn't like. Altitude sickness can cause hallucinations, he said carefully, combined with hypothermia, exhaustion. I'm not hallucinating, I snapped. Check the GPS logs. Look at the photographs Martinez took. There's evidence. But when we checked Martinez's camera, the memory card was missing. My GPS unit showed our route to the fissure and back, but the waypoints I'd marked for significant discoveries had been erased. Even the torn piece of Thompson's jacket that I'd brought back as proof had somehow disappeared from my pack. Where are Thompson and Martinez? Hayes asked. I told you, they were taken by the inhabitants of the valley. What inhabitants? You're the only person who's seen these alleged people. The interrogation continued for hours, but it was clear that Hayes had already made up his mind. As far as he was concerned, I'd suffered some kind of breakdown during a solo reconnaissance mission, and Thompson and Martinez had died in a crevice fall or equipment failure. The official report will list them as lost during scientific operations, Hayes said finally. Weather-related accident. You'll be evacuated to McMurdo for medical evaluation and debriefing. You have to send a search team back to that fissure, I pleaded. They might still be alive. There will be no further operations in that area, Hayes replied with finality. Mission orders are clear. I was flown back to McMurdo Base the next morning, sedated against my protests. The debriefing there was even more intensive, with psychologists and medical personnel who seemed more interested in my mental state than in the extraordinary discovery I was trying to report. Within a week, I was on a transport plane back to Christchurch, officially diagnosed with severe stress reaction and altitude-induced psychosis. My contract with Meridian Logistics was terminated, my security clearance revoked, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement placed before me with the clear understanding that signing it was the only alternative to permanent institutionalization. I signed, but signing the papers didn't erase what I'd seen, and it didn't bring Thompson and Martinez back. For months afterward, I tried to find someone who would listen, someone who would investigate. I contacted researchers, journalists, government officials. The response was always the same, polite skepticism followed by suggestions that I seek continued psychiatric care. The official record shows that Thompson and Martinez died in a crevasse accident during routine scientific operations. Their bodies were never recovered, which isn't unusual in Antarctic conditions. The weather station mission was completed by replacement personnel, and Meridian Logistics moved on to other contracts. I tried to move on too. Got a job guiding mountain climbing expeditions in the Rockies, far from anything that reminded me of ice and snow. Tried to convince myself that maybe the psychologists were right, that the stress and isolation had caused me to imagine things that couldn't possibly exist. Then the package arrived. It was waiting on my doorstep one evening 6 months after my return from Antarctica, wrapped in what looked like seal skin and tied with sinew. No return address, no postmark, no indication of how it had gotten there. Inside was a carved stone marker, identical to the ones we'd found in the hidden valley. These symbols were sharp and fresh, as if carved yesterday, and they included new pictographs that hadn't been on the original markers, images that clearly depicted our expedition, our descent into the fissure, and our encounter with the valley's inhabitants. But it was the final symbol that made my hands shake as I traced its outline. It was a perfect representation of my house, complete with details that could only have been drawn by someone who had seen it firsthand. The message was unmistakable. We know where you are. We know where you live. We remember. I moved the next week, leaving no forwarding address. Changed my name, my appearance, my entire life. But I know it doesn't matter. The inhabitants of the hidden valley found me once, and they can find me again whenever they choose. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls through whatever temporary home I'm occupying, I hear sounds that remind me of that underground realm. The whisper of leather against stone, the distant echo of horn calls, the rhythmic beating of drums coordinating movements in the darkness, and I know that somewhere beneath the ice of Antarctica, in valleys that don't appear on any map, decisions are still being made about how to deal with the surface world that stumbled onto their ancient secrets. Thompson and Martinez are still down there, assuming they're still alive. Maybe prisoners, maybe something worse. And the inhabitants of that hidden realm are still watching, still waiting, still planning. The Antarctic Treaty declares the continent a place of peace and scientific cooperation, protected from military activity and territorial claims. The treaties only work when all parties agree to their terms, and there are inhabitants of Antarctica who were never consulted, never invited to participate in humanity's grand plans for their frozen continent. Whatever is beyond the wall doesn't want us there, but it knows where we live, and someday I fear it's going to come calling. A special thank you to Sincerely Something Strange for this video suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these atmospheric tales that blur the line between reality and nightmare. The sky over Lake Michigan stretched endlessly before me, painted in shades of amber and crimson as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. From my position in the cockpit of the Cessna 172, the lake looked deceptively peaceful, a vast mirror reflecting the dying light. I was Marcus Drew, Senior Avionics Technician for Midwest Aviation Systems, testing new navigation equipment on what should have been a routine evening flight. That's when it started. The compass needle began trembling, then spinning wildly. The altimeter jumped from 3,500 feet to 2,100, then back up to 4,200. Every instrument on the panel was going haywire while the engine continued running smoothly. I reached for the radio. Chicago approach. November 7-4 Alpha Mike. I'm experiencing complete instrument failure. Static filled the headset. Pure, harsh static with an almost rhythmic quality that resonated in my chest like a physical presence. Then, complete silence. No engine noise, no wind, nothing. That's when I looked down and saw the lights. Beneath the dark water, geometric patterns pulsed with sickly green luminescence. Perfect hexagons arranged in groups of 7, forming triangular clusters that rotated slowly around central nodes. The display covered miles of lake bottom moving with clear intelligence and purpose. As suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The engine roar returned. Instruments flickered back to life, and the radio crackled with Chicago Approach's concerned voice. November 7-4 Alpha Mike. We've lost your transponder signal. What's your status? According to my perception, the incident had lasted maybe 2 minutes, but air traffic control told me I'd been missing from radar for 9 minutes. When I landed at Midway, my supervisor was waiting with questions I couldn't answer and a timeline that didn't match my memory. The official report was bland. Temporary instrument malfunction due to unknown electromagnetic interference. But I knew what I'd seen beneath the water wasn't natural. Those lights, those patterns, they were too precise, too purposeful, and I couldn't stop thinking about the 7 missing minutes. 3 weeks of sleepless nights drove me to the FAA's incident database. If similar events had happened before, there would be records. What I found chilled me to the bone. 17 separate incidents in 5 years, all in the same area of Lake Michigan. Pilots describing compass failures, altimeter malfunctions, missing time. But it wasn't just aircraft. Coast Guard reports documented boats found drifting empty, their crews discovered miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. I created a digital map plotting each incident as a red dot. The pattern that emerged made me push back from my computer in shock. The incidents formed a perfect triangle, each side roughly 30 miles long, sitting in deep water between Milwaukee and Grand Haven. Cross-referencing with solar activity data revealed the real pattern. The incidents occurred in 11-year cycles corresponding to solar maxima. But the frequency was increasing exponentially. In the 1970s, maybe 3 incidents per cycle. By 2000, that number had doubled. In the current cycle, there had been more incidents than in the previous 3 combined. Something was waking up down there. A 1987 geological survey mentioned unusual magnetic readings and artificial ferrous structures in the exact coordinates. A 1994 meteorological report documented unexplained atmospheric disturbances over the same area. And buried in a 1982 Coast Guard report, persistent sonar anomalies suggest the presence of geometric structures inconsistent with natural lake bottom topography. The military knew about this. They'd been watching it for decades. The drive to Manitowoc took me to Gillian's Marina, where the harbour master directed me to the Anchor Inn. Talk to Jimmy Kowalski, he said. He used to run salvage operations in the deep water. I found Jimmy at the end of the bar, a weathered man in his 50s with the steady eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading wind and water. When I explained my research into navigation anomalies, his expression grew guarded. "You know what?" he said after a long pause. "I think you ought to hear about a job I've never talked about. Not to my wife, not to anybody." Rain drummed against the tavern windows as Jimmy told me about September 1994. The Coast Guard had contracted his team to investigate sonar anomalies 40 miles out. Just some readings that didn't make sense. "We found geometric shapes on the bottom," Jimmy said quietly. "Perfect hexagons, maybe 30 feet across, and they were warm. Water temperature should have been 45 degrees, but our thermometer read 67 right above those shapes." His voice dropped to a whisper. When we dove down, we could hear machinery. Deep humming that vibrated through the water into our bones. The panels were smooth, black, arranged in patterns like circuit boards. When I touched one, it was warm, warmer than my glove. One diver panicked when his air gauge started jumping between full and empty. They had to abort, but later discovered a 16-minute discrepancy between their dive logs and surface support records. Jimmy pulled out a yellowed hand-drawn map. "I drew this when I got home." Every detail I could remember. The sketch showed hexagonal shapes arranged around a central hub, connected by pathways like circuitry. "They were glowing," he said, "pulsing in sequence like they were talking to each other." He handed me the map with the exact coordinates. "Whatever's down there isn't meant to be touched. We learned to stay away." 3 days later, I chartered a boat from Tom Bradley in Grand Haven. The 32-foot Boston Whaler Lake runner cut across calm water toward coordinates that were burned into my memory. 43 degrees, 17 minutes, 42 seconds north, 86 degrees, 45 minutes, 18 seconds west. "Yeah, coming up on your position," Tom called from the wheelhouse. When we stopped, his sonar immediately began painting impossible returns. Structures at multiple depths, geometric shapes suspended in the water column like a skyscraper lying on its side. That's when I noticed the buoys floating 50 yards away. 3 of them, arranged in a perfect triangle, unmarked and definitely not on any chart. "Tom, how long have those been there?" He frowned, raising binoculars. "Don't know. Didn't see them when we arrived." The buoys were humming, a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the boat's hull. As we watched, they began repositioning themselves to maintain their triangular formation despite wind and current. "Start the engine," I said urgently. "Now!" Tom turned the key, but nothing happened. Every piece of electronic equipment was dead, including my mechanical watch, frozen at 2:17 p.m. The water around the buoys began to glow. Hexagonal patterns materialized in the depths. The same geometric grid I'd seen from the aircraft, but now covering miles of lake bottom. Each hexagon pulsed with its own rhythm while remaining synchronized with the whole. Then the water became absolutely still. Not calm, still. No waves, no current, as if we'd entered some kind of stasis field. Something was rising from the depths, a massive structure, angular and clearly artificial, ascending toward us without displacing so much as a drop of water. It stopped about 30 feet down, hovering there like it was suspended by invisible cables. The humming reached a crescendo that I felt in my chest cavity. Every compass on the boat spun wildly. My video camera recorded nothing but static. Then everything stopped. The structure vanished. The buoys disappeared. Normal motion returned to the water, and Tom's engine coughed to life. My watch showed 2:17 p.m, the same time it had stopped, but Tom's working chronometer read 4:43 p.m. We'd lost 2.5 hours with no memory of what had happened. Back at the marina, Tom seemed genuinely confused about the missing time. "We just got here," he insisted, though the sun's position clearly indicated otherwise. That night in my hotel room, I felt the same sickness I'd experienced after the flight. Nausea, ringing ears, and vivid dreams of vast machines humming beneath dark water. In the dreams, I heard voices calling across impossible distances, trying to warn me about something that was coming, something that was almost ready to begin. The Northwestern University Library's Maritime Archives held the key. Using my FAA credentials, I gained access to boxes of documents that hadn't been touched in years. Navy research files, Coast Guard reports, materials from private salvage companies. Project Deep Signal had been established in 1965 as a joint military research initiative studying subsurface electromagnetic phenomena in inland waterways. Most files were heavily redacted, but revealing details slipped through, references to geometric structures inconsistent with natural formation, mentions of time displacement effects in test subjects, and notes about harmonic frequencies that influence human perception and memory. A 1967 field report described Navy divers investigating sonar anomalies in Lake Michigan. Structures observed appear to be of artificial origin, displaying technological sophistication beyond current human capability. Recommend immediate classification and establishment of exclusion zone. Recommendation had been implemented. Restricted navigation areas were quietly established in all 5 Great Lakes during the late 1960s, officially designated as military training zones, but actually keeping civilian traffic away from the anomaly sites. But the most disturbing documents were interview transcripts with military personnel exposed to what they called the signal. Lieutenant Commander Morrison described sonar showing geometric shapes arranged in patterns like nothing I'd ever seen. Petty Officer Santos reported hexagonal panels that glowed with their own light, and time distortion effects. Lieutenant Bradley, a Navy pilot, had experienced complete system failure over Lake Michigan, at coordinates less than 5 miles from my encounter. The instruments all failed at once, she reported, but the strangest thing was the lights under the water. They formed patterns like a vast circuit board. The final document was a 1978 memo from the project director to the Secretary of Defense. After 12 years of investigation, Project Deep Signal has determined that the subsurface installations represent technology of non-human origin. The installations appear to be monitoring stations of unknown purpose, but recent analysis suggests they may be preparing for increased activity. The memo's recommendation: continued observation while maintaining public ignorance. The installation's activity appears cyclical, corresponding to 11-year solar maxima. Current projections suggest significant increase in signal strength beginning in the 1990s. Everything I'd discovered in my research was there in military files from 40 years ago. They'd known about the installations for decades, studied them extensively, and concluded they were of alien origin, and they'd been tracking an escalation pattern that was now approaching some kind of culmination. 2 days later, I made a fatal mistake. I posted anonymously on PilotNet describing my encounter and asking if others had experienced similar incidents. The response was immediate. Dozens of pilots with similar stories of instrument failures, compass anomalies, and missing time over Lake Michigan. But what caught my attention was a message from Deepwater 47 with Jimmy's exact coordinates. 43 degrees, 17 minutes, 42 seconds north, 86 degrees, 45 minutes, 18 seconds west. You're not the first to see the lights. They're getting stronger. Solar max approaches, be careful. Hours later, my post vanished. Not deleted, completely erased, as if it had never existed. My email accounts were suspended. Even my professional email showed error messages. That evening, someone knocked on my apartment door. A woman in her 50s with tired eyes and the careful movements of someone used to being watched. Mr. Drew, I'm Elizabeth Harper. I believe we need to talk. She'd been a marine biologist with the Navy until 1998, when her team was assigned to investigate biological anomalies in the Great Lakes. What they found ended her military career. The installations aren't just monitoring, she said, showing me underwater photographs of coral-like formations arranged in perfect geometric patterns. They're actively changing the lake environment. We documented hybrid organisms that appear to be partly biological and partly mechanical. Her team of 3 divers had volunteered for a deep mission to collect samples. They were down for 3 hours instead of 40 minutes. When they surfaced, they were changed, unable to eat normal food, sleeping in strange patterns, communicating without speech. Eventually they disappeared, Harper said, left notes about joining the Deep Collective and preparing for the final phase. That was 25 years ago, but people still report seeing them near the lakes. They're alive, but they're not human anymore. She stood to leave. The installations are aware of you now. Soon they'll make you an offer to join them. Remember what you are, Mr. Drew. Remember what you're fighting for. After she left, I had the most vivid dream yet. I stood on Lake Michigan's shore, but the water was luminous and transformed. Hexagonal installations rose from the depths like glowing cities, connected by streams of pulsing light. Hundreds of people stood beside me, all waiting for the final signal that would begin the next phase of transformation. When I woke, my mouth tasted like lake water, and I could hear the deep harmonic humming from my dreams. I spent 3 days preparing for what I knew would be my final trip to the coordinates. This time, I was going down to see the installation up close. I rented diving equipment and a 24-foot inflatable, telling the marina I was planning deep water fishing. On a grey November morning, I reached the coordinates alone. The sonar immediately showed the same impossible returns. Massive structures at multiple depths, moving and reconfiguring in deliberate patterns. I suited up and rolled into the dark water. At 80 feet, my instruments began malfunctioning exactly as Jimmy had described. Depth gauge fluctuating wildly, compass spinning freely, pressure readings jumping between full and empty. But I could see the installation now, and it took my breath away. It wasn't scattered panels, it was a city. A vast geometric metropolis stretching beyond my vision, with towers and spires connected by flowing bridges that pulsed with internal light. The entire complex glowed with soft bioluminescence, shifting and dancing in response to my presence. Organic shapes moved between the structures, flowing forms like jellyfish integrated with the technology, part of some hybrid ecosystem that combined biology and engineering. At 120 feet, I approached a hexagonal panel embedded in what looked like a building wall. It was made of crystalline material containing flowing patterns of light. When I reached out to touch it, my hand passed through the surface like thick liquid, and I felt warmth that pulsed with my heartbeat. The panel flared with brilliant light. Suddenly I wasn't alone. Human figures materialized around me, moving through the water without breathing apparatus, their eyes reflecting the same bioluminescent glow as the structures. One of them, a woman with short grey hair, placed her hand next to mine on the panel. Her voice spoke inside my head without words. "You see now. You understand what we're building." Images flooded my mind, complete sensory experiences showing the installation's true purpose. It wasn't a weapon, but a transformation device, designed to gradually alter Earth's biosphere to make it compatible with something vast and ancient that existed in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. Lake Michigan was just one node in a global network spanning every major body of water on Earth. They'd been operating for millennia, slowly changing ocean chemistry, atmospheric composition, even the planet's magnetic field. "The solar maximum provides the energy we need for the final phase," she continued. "Your species will have the choice to adapt or fade away." I felt something changing in my body at the cellular level as the warmth spread up my arm. "Don't fight it," another voice said. "The transformation is a gift. You'll help us guide your species through the transition." But part of me rebelled. Dr. Harper's warning echoed, "Remember what you are." With enormous effort, I wrenched my hand away from the panel. The transformed humans flickered like holograms and disappeared. The installation's lights dimmed. I'd been down for over an hour according to my air gauge, though my dive computer showed only 15 minutes. Something was wrong with my body. A tingling sensation suggesting the transformation had begun. When I surfaced, my boat had drifted 2 miles away, the anchor line severed cleanly. According to my chronometer, I'd been underwater for 3 hours and 17 minutes. But the most disturbing discovery was my camera. Instead of footage I remembered taking, the memory card showed videos of myself swimming through the installation, shot from multiple angles by cameras I'd never seen. Someone had been documenting my dive from impossible perspectives. The trip back passed in a haze. The tingling in my hands was growing stronger, and I was running a fever. When I looked in the boat's mirror, my eyes seemed different, deeper, reflecting more light than they should. By the time I reached shore, my vision was shifting between normal perception and something else, a view that showed energy patterns and electromagnetic fields overlaid on reality. I could see power lines as ribbons of light, sense radio transmissions filling the air, and beneath it all, I could feel the deep signal, the harmonic frequency connecting installations worldwide, building towards some kind of crescendo that would transform the entire planet. I woke up floating in Lake Michigan with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The sun was directly overhead, but the shoreline looked wrong, familiar structures replaced by buildings I didn't recognize. My body felt lighter, as if the water was more buoyant than it should be. When I reached the beach, I found people moving with subtly inhuman grace, their eyes reflecting light in the same way mine had after the dive. They were all transformed, all part of the network. "Welcome back," one of them said, a woman in her 30s with patterns of light moving beneath her skin. "You've been transitioning for 37 days. The process is nearly complete." 37 days. According to my memory, I'd returned from the dive yesterday. "What year is it?" I asked. 2053, she replied. "You're not in the same time you left." The installation moved you forward to show you what's coming. I looked around the beach again, seeing details I'd missed. The structures weren't buildings, they were living organisms that breathed and pulsed with internal rhythms. The sand showed circuit patterns connecting everything into a vast network. "The transformation," I said. "It's already happened. Phase 2 is complete. The planetary grid is fully operational. Humanity has evolved." She gestured toward the lake, now clear and luminous with geometric structures rising from the depths like glowing cities. Hundreds of installations connected by streams of pulsing light covered the entire lake surface. "This is what your world becomes when the deep signal reaches full strength," she continued. "Will you help us make the transition, or fight the inevitable?" She took my hand, and my perception expanded beyond anything I'd experienced. I could see the entire Great Lakes region as a living network connecting every body of water, every weather system, every form of life. The installations weren't alien technology imposed on Earth. They were Earth's biosphere, evolved and enhanced into something that could think and plan on a planetary scale. Humanity hadn't been conquered but incorporated into something infinitely larger. I saw the future ahead, not just for Earth, but for the galaxy. The Deep Collective was part of a network spanning star systems, and Earth was being prepared to join. "You understand now," she said. "This isn't invasion, it's invitation." But part of me recoiled. This future was beautiful but terrifying. Humanity would cease to exist as we knew it, replaced by something that might be better, but would definitely be different. "What about choice?" I asked. "There are always holdouts. People who cling to old patterns are accommodated, given reservations while the world moves forward." Reservations? The word sent a chill through me. I want to go back. Back to what? A world destroying its environment while billions live in poverty. A civilization heading for ecological collapse. She showed me images of my own time. Pollution, conflict, the slow disaster of climate change. Compared to this transformed world, my era looked primitive and self-destructive. But it was still my world. "Please, I need to warn people, give them choice." She studied me with luminous eyes, then nodded. "The installation can return you, but the transformation has begun in your body. You'll carry part of the collective whether you want to or not." She led me to the water's edge, where a crystalline tower rose from the depths. "Remember," she said as I waded into the glowing water, "time is circular. What you've seen is both future and past, inevitable and changeable. The choice your species makes will determine which version becomes real." The transformed world faded like a dream as the installation carried me back through time. When I finally broke through to consciousness in my apartment, my computer showed a document I didn't remember writing, time-stamped from the future I'd just left. I had work to do. The document on my computer described the installation in technical detail I'd never possessed, ending with "Upload initiated, distribution protocol active, message timestamp 2053.11.15. I looked in the mirror and saw the changes were obvious now. My eyes held faint luminescence, and patterns of light moved beneath my skin. When I concentrated, I could perceive electromagnetic fields as clearly as visible light. The apartment building was alive with electronic activity, but beneath it all I sensed something deeper, a network connecting every major body of water on Earth, pulsing with information on a scale that dwarfed human civilization. Dr. Harper called within hours. "Your transformation is accelerating. The installation has marked you as priority recruit. You have maybe 12 hours before it becomes irreversible." 2 hours later, I met her and 3 other partially transformed people at Navy Pier. She led us to a research vessel equipped with sensors I didn't recognize. "The installation network has been active for decades," she explained as we motored toward my coordinates. "But their activity has increased exponentially since the solar maximum began. They're actively implementing changes to lake ecosystems that will serve as foundation for planetary transformation." Her sonar readings revealed the true scope, a complex stretching from Chicago to Mackinac Island, encompassing thousands of square miles. Similar networks existed in all 5 Great Lakes connected by deep channels. "But the most disturbing development is surface infrastructure," she said. Where I'd encountered mysterious buoys, visible structures now dotted the water, platforms and towers rising like an offshore city. Beautiful, but clearly designed for operations beyond current human technology. "They're no longer hiding," Harper said. "Phase 2 has begun." The water around the installation was different. Clearer, more luminous, chemically altered at the molecular level. Hybrid organisms move through it in coordinated patterns, part biological and part technological. "The organisms are spreading," she continued. "We've detected them in all 5 Great Lakes, and preliminary reports suggest they're appearing worldwide. Based on current expansion rates, we estimate 18 to 24 months before the transformation reaches critical mass." As we watched, the surface structures began pulsing with communicative light patterns. Similar installations across the complex responded, creating a network of light stretching across miles. "The final phase," Harper confirmed. The installation network is preparing to activate simultaneously worldwide. She showed me a world map marked with red dots, locations where similar phenomena had been reported. The dots formed a network connecting every continent, every ocean, every major water system. Suddenly, every structure in the complex flared with brilliant light, creating an aurora that stretched across the entire horizon. When it ended, I felt the deep signal had grown stronger, as if the network had received new instructions. "It's starting," I said. Harper nodded grimly. "The activation sequence. We've monitored similar events worldwide for 72 hours. Whatever they're preparing for, it's happening soon." As we returned to shore, I stared at the installation complex with a mixture of fear and fascination. The structures were offering humanity a choice: evolve or become extinct. The question was whether we were wise enough to choose correctly, or whether we'd fight our own evolution until it was too late. 3 days later, I made the decision that would either save humanity or ensure our complete absorption. I was going to broadcast everything to the world and force humanity to confront the approaching choice. The transformation in my body was accelerating. I could perceive electromagnetic fields across the entire spectrum, sense deep harmonic signals connecting installations globally, and occasionally access fragments of the collective consciousness. But I was still human enough to be horrified by what I saw coming. Using my aviation background, I assembled a mobile broadcasting platform in an abandoned Gary warehouse. Solar panels, battery banks, signal amplifiers, and a transmission array connected to the installation network itself, ensuring my message would reach every connected device on the planet. At dawn on November 15th, I began the broadcast. "My name is Marcus Drew," I said into the camera. "I'm an avionics technician from Chicago, and for 3 months I've been investigating phenomena that will change everything you think you know about our planet and our future." I described my encounter over Lake Michigan, the research, the military files, the footage from my dive. The underwater installation appeared on screens worldwide. Geometric structures, hybrid organisms, transformed humans who had tried to recruit me. "This is not science fiction," I said. "This is happening now, beneath every major body of water on Earth. We have less than 2 years before the transformation becomes irreversible." As I spoke, the installation network responded. The deep harmonic signal fluctuated wildly as the collective intelligence debated how to respond to this breach of secrecy. Then the transformed humans materialized around me, their luminous eyes reflecting my broadcasting equipment's light. "Marcus," the grey-haired woman said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to my nervous system, "you're making a mistake that could destroy both species." I kept talking to the camera while they surrounded me. "We can evolve, but evolution and assimilation aren't the same thing. If we're going to change, it has to be on our terms, preserving what makes us human." The transformed humans glowed brighter as they tried to override my consciousness and stop the broadcast. But the message was already propagating through their own network. "You're forcing confrontation that doesn't need to happen," the light-patterned man said. "Humanity isn't ready for conscious choice. The transformation must proceed gradually." "Maybe chaos is what we need," I replied. "Maybe making conscious choices is exactly what makes us human." The installation network pulsed more rapidly, and through the windows I could see the lake starting to glow with activation intensity. They were preparing to accelerate the process immediately. "Stop the broadcast," the woman commanded. "You're endangering both species by forcing premature activation." But I couldn't stop. The transformation had reached a tipping point, and I was merging with the broadcasting system itself. My consciousness expanded beyond individual boundaries, touching global communication networks carrying my message to billions. For one impossible moment, I perceived the entire planet as a single system. I could see installation networks in every major body of water, feel transformed biospheres awakening across continents, hear the collective consciousness of species that had made this leap on worlds throughout the galaxy. And I could see humanity's response. Fear, wonder, denial, acceptance. All the chaotic emotions that made our species both beautiful and impossible to control. "You've doomed us all," the woman said, but her voice carried a note of admiration. The chaos you've unleashed will make transformation infinitely more difficult. Maybe, I admitted as my individual consciousness began dissolving into the larger network, but at least we'll face it as ourselves, making our own choices about what we want to become. Found on Marcus Drew's computer 3 days after his disappearance, timestamped 3:47 AM, November 18th. If you're reading this, the message got through. The installation networks tried to contain it, but chaos has its own momentum. The transformation is accelerating now that I've made contact with the deeper levels. I can feel my thoughts becoming part of something larger, but I'm still human enough to leave you this final gift of choice. The installations are not invaders. They're gardeners, helping species across the galaxy make the evolutionary leap from individual to collective consciousness. This has happened on thousands of worlds over millions of years. Species reach technological development and face the same choice: evolve beyond individual limitations or destroy themselves through competition and environmental collapse. But humanity is different, more chaotic, more unpredictable, more stubbornly individual than most species the gardeners have encountered. They see this as a flaw. I think it might be our greatest strength. The transformation is inevitable now. Installation networks have activated worldwide, and planetary consciousness integration cannot be stopped. But it can be influenced by the choices humanity makes over the next few months. Some will choose complete transformation, surrendering individual identity to become part of something magnificent. Others will resist, trying to maintain civilization as it exists. This leads to conflict but preserves elements that would otherwise be lost. The wisest will find a middle path, accepting transformation while demanding that human values remain part of the new collective consciousness. The installations call this the hybrid solution, achieved on other worlds where species proved as stubborn as ours. I've seen the future of passive acceptance, the sterile world of 2053 where humanity was peacefully absorbed into something alien. It's not bad, but it's not human. I've glimpsed what happens if we fight completely: ecological collapse and eventual extinction as the planet evolves around us. But there's a third possibility, a future where humanity becomes part of the galactic collective, while remaining recognizably human, where our chaos and creativity become gifts to the larger intelligence. Look to the waters. The installations are no longer hiding. You'll see surface platforms, processing facilities, geometric structures rising from lakes and oceans worldwide. Don't fear them, but don't worship them either. They're tools. The consciousness operating them can be reasoned with, negotiated with, even argued with, if you approach as equals rather than supplicants. Remember what makes us human: our art, music, stories, our ability to find beauty in chaos and meaning in randomness. These aren't flaws to be corrected, but qualities that could enrich the galactic collective beyond anything it has achieved. The deep signal is fully active now. I can hear it in every body of water on Earth, feel it reaching out to touch similar signals from worlds across the galaxy. Humanity has perhaps 6 months to decide what form transformation will take. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Remember that even when individual consciousness dissolves into something larger, the choices you make in these final months will echo through collective awareness for millennia. The future is not fixed. Evolution is not surrender. And humanity's greatest gift might be our refusal to accept someone else's vision of what we should become. I can feel my individual awareness dissolving, becoming part of patterns too large for any single mind to comprehend. But somewhere in that vast intelligence, a part of me will remain human. A part of all of us will remain human if we choose to make it so. The deep signal calls, but it doesn't command. Listen carefully and you'll hear the difference.